Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support from you guys on all the recent content. With the trade deadline 3 days away, we're going to be focusing today's episode around our predictions and thoughts on the upcoming deadline. And before we get into this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so I guess the first story, we'll go through some injury updates, and the first one is on Joel Embiid. And this one actually was coming through roughly, I guess, maybe an hour or so before we actually got on to record.
Yeah.
And it's basically, what Woj and Shams had put out was that he pretty much is having, surgery on his meniscus. It was a displaced flap, I believe, in his meniscus, which they basically said is like a torn meniscus, or I guess treated like one. So they did say he's going to miss extended time, so that obviously means that he's not coming back anytime soon. There was one part that was kind of a little, I guess, I don't know, not scary, but a little concerning, where they said the door isn't closed on an Embiid return this season, but there will be a clearer idea on a timeline once the procedure is complete. So, it's nice that they're not outright saying he's going to miss the rest of the season. But, when it said, the door isn't closed, that suggests, okay, that extended amount of time may be longer, than you would hope for. Because, I guess we're already in February, right? So the playoffs essentially would be, in, 2.5 months. So let's say his recovery time, we won't know. But let's say it's 2 months, right? Well, then that basically means, right around, the start of the playoffs. And, they're already kind of in a weird spot in the standings where they've lost most of their recent games. Because they obviously need him to win a lot of those games. So now, they're going to be without him for a while. Maxey, I guess this is going to be his opportunity to step up and carry an even bigger, load on the offensive end. But then I guess also, it also kind of suggests that they're going to have to potentially be a little more aggressive at the deadline, or I guess, try to decide whether or not they still go all in on the hopes that he can come back, or do you maybe just decide maybe just do something small and then just wait until the off season, because if he doesn't come back relatively soon, then you might be in trouble. So I don't know, obviously it's tough injury news, but what do you think ultimately how this will affect their approach?
Yeah, it's a big deal because, first of all, it's a very complex injury. I think people don't really understand the gravity of what that kind of injury is, and especially what it takes to treat it, because I don't want to get too gruesome, and I'm not, but, part of his meniscus is going to have to be removed and replaced, so that's going to be really, really tough. I think that's kind of what they're hinting at. So he's going to be out for a significant amount of time, and we kind of thought that they're going to fall in the standings. They're still, fifth, I think, right now, 30 and 18, so, it's tough, so they're really going to have to be banking on Maxey to elevate his play, and yeah, they're at a crossroads where, like you said, they really have to decide if they want to go out and grab somebody now that can potentially impact how they're going to end the season, or, are they just going to throw it away and tank it a little bit and just hope for the best in the offseason? Because I think, both you could win-win in both scenarios. I wouldn't really have an issue with either way it goes, but yeah, they definitely do have to make a decision because I think time is kind of running out on them.
Yeah, and that's the tough part, because again, even beyond, how this affects the MVP race or anything like that, it's also just like you said, a very significant injury that's going to cause him to miss a lot of time. And then even when he comes back, right, you'd expect there would need to be somewhat of a ramp up.
Yep.
In order to return to form. And that's what sucks about this, right? Because again, he, was playing great basketball, right? Basically the best basketball he's ever played. And now it's going to be cut short, right, due to a bad injury, right? A freak injury, right, as well. It's not like it's one where it was kind of wear and tear. It was literally just, guy falls into your knee, which we've seen, dozens of times. And sometimes you can come out lucky and it's just kind of like a stinger. And then other times it's something like that. So,
yeah, it's crazy because, Embiid was on track to be, I think, break Wilt's little record. If you guys are into smaller analytics, I think he was averaging the most points per minute of a player all time. So, he was breaking Wilt's record where, Wilt was, I think, averaging 50 or something like that.
Yeah.
Different time period, obviously, but still nonetheless very
Yeah.
impressive. So sad to
Right.
see it kind of get cut short. And I think, if I were Philly, I would take the more cautious approach. Don't, I guess force him or, potentially rush him to come back, which I don't think they will. But yeah,
Yeah.
they definitely do have to weigh, some risk and benefits of an all in push for, a championship, especially looking at where they are in the seeding. 'Cause, I'm sure they're going to take their time with this decision. But like I said, time's running out on them.
Right. And it's not just that he's going to be out, right? Like this stretch of games, some of these games, are going to be tough. Not all of them, but a decent chunk of them, right? You're going to have to be playing teams like Dallas, right? You're going to have to play, Golden State, who's pretty desperate for wins, right? A team like Atlanta that might be desperate for wins, right? Cleveland, Miami, New York, Milwaukee, Boston, right?
Mhm.
These are all games within the next, few weeks, right? So I mean, those are all pretty significant matchups where, like, obviously, you have the advantage if Embiid's there, but if he's not, right, then you're kind of back to square one. So that's the tough part. So I do
Yeah.
kind of wonder um, what the approach will be. I think they have basically 2 games before the deadline, right? Because obviously the deadline, is only a few days away. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they approach it. And then you have another guy, right, who, you know, is also hurt, and unlike Embiid, he's already been ruled out for the rest of the season. That's Zach Levine for the Bulls, right? And so obviously that can impact, what the Bulls might do this trade deadline, right? Because he was a name that had been in trade rumors, right? I don't think we didn't necessarily expect him to be traded, although, some people had said, I think it was Zach Lowe on his podcast, he mentioned that there had been a lot of talks about him potentially landing in Detroit, right? Where, Detroit would probably send some guys, right? And then maybe like one blue chip dude, right? And then Chicago might have to attach something because, people see that as a negative contract. But,
Yeah.
you would imagine that that stuff is probably done because, he's not going to be playing this season.
Yeah.
So that may just be something that, these teams revisit in the offseason. But that's tough, obviously, because, if you're the Bulls, you might have been kind of looking forward to, not again, it has nothing to do with him, but you might have been looking forward to maybe being able to move him and just, kind of getting some other stuff back and then kind of figuring out how to retool in the offseason. But now you're going to have to probably wait longer on that as well. And, again, if a team was interested in, right, then that takes his name, out of the race because you wouldn't trade for an injured guy right now that's like, a star player on like a big contract, right? This isn't like Adams where, it's a smaller contract. This is 40 million. So you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you got 40 million worth of somebody who's not playing at all this year.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting, but what I did hear was like I think they're going to be probably moving forward with Levine. I think it was Billy Donovan. He said he had no conversations with Bulls management about how the injury would impact the team's future. So I mean, I guess that means they're going to stick with him. So I think that's the best thing available because, like you were saying, you can't really get rid of a player of his caliber when he's going to be having a surgery and be out 4 to 6 months. There'd be no point in really trading for him and even really trying to get rid of him because I doubt the returns would be all that great. So it is what it is. But this is also another guy that's had some serious injury history as well because I think in the last 3 seasons I think he's missed double-digit games. So both these guys, they can't really stay healthy, and that's been the narrative on their careers. But nonetheless, great players, and wishing the best for them as they
Yeah.
continue to heal.
Yeah. Like you said, hopefully, he'll find his way back next season. Yeah.
For
So
sure.
if you look at his games played, 25 this season, last season, 77. And then the year before that, 67. So, and then before that, 58. I think that was a shortened season.
Yeah.
60, that was a shortened season. Then 63, 24, 47. So, it's up and down, right? There's been seasons where he's not missed a lot of time, but like you said, obviously now, as he's approaching, a little bit later in his career, right? He's what, like 28, right? Soon to be 29. So,
Yeah.
now he's gotten to a point where he's had a few major injuries, right? He had the ACL tear, right? Obviously, he's got this, foot thing that's going on. So
Hmm.
those are major injuries, to keep an eye on, to watch out for as as somebody decides on what to do with him in the offseason.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now I guess, we'll kind of get into, more of the nitty gritty, right? With the actual trade deadline, that is Thursday at 8 p. Oh, excuse me, not 8 p.m. What am I talking about? The trade deadline at 3 p.m., right, is when it ends, right? So after that, right, you'll sometimes get like a few trades maybe that come out after, but regardless, 3 p.m. is the official deadline. So
Yes,
obviously we're
sir.
going to do a live stream. I think we're going to start around noon and then probably work our way until 3:30 ish. Depending on how many things come out, and potentially have discussions if people are there. But now it's kind of money time, right? Where again, you have a few days left. We know teams, are kind of figuring out what to do, right? Because we had a stretch where it was kind of quiet, right? Where there hasn't really been a whole lot talked about, mainly just because I think, some teams, basically they're saying that like a lot of the teams that have players to move, they're kind of, their asking prices were really high, and the amount of trades that we see is going to be kind of dependent on if those asking prices are lowered or if a team is desperate enough to like, up their offers, which I don't think is going to be the case because, compared to some other deadlines in the past, right? We already had some major moves that happened before, right? Like even in the offseason, right? You had like Porzingis be moved, right? Bradley Beal, Damian Lillard. Obviously in the last few weeks, right, we had like OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam. So now there's not as many big time game changers left, right? It's
Yeah.
mainly, like role players, guys that could probably help, other teams, but maybe not necessarily guys that completely change your life. But still, you'd rather have them than maybe who you have right now. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I guess now, we're gonna kind of, I guess, work our way from, the bad teams, right? The bottom feeders of the league, because those
Yes,
are the
sir.
teams that kind of have more things to give away, right? Like if
Yes.
you're, I don't know, like the Minnesota Timberwolves or the Thunder, right? You're not looking to give away guys, you're
No.
looking to add pieces. So we'll
Absolutely.
start, yeah, so we'll kind of start, I guess, from the seller's perspective. So we'll start with Detroit, right? So we obviously know their roster, right? We know that the record is pretty bad, pretty horrible, not a lot of wings going on there.
No.
But regardless, you look at the players, right? Obviously, if the Levine trade isn't happening, right? My guess is that most of the young guys are probably going to stay. Although we did have one guy in Killian Hayes who did request a trade, right? So,
Yeah.
he,
Big deal,
you
man. It's
know,
a total game changer.
yeah, so I do kind of wonder, if Detroit honors his trade request, as we've typically seen, most star players and most players, get treated with, right? Like usually they get their way, right, and they end up getting moved. So we'll see. But outside of him, right, obviously the main guys, right? Like I don't think Cade Cunningham is going anywhere. I don't
No.
think Asura Thompson or Ivy, or Duran is going anywhere, right? You never know with Detroit, but I don't think so. Sasser, I don't think is going anywhere. So
Mm-mm.
you're kind of looking at the guys that are either the veterans, or some of these other guys that like maybe some teams might be interested in, right? So like let's say like an Alec Burks, or an Isaiah Stewart, right? Or Boyan Bogdanovich, Joe Harris, Monte Morris, right? A lot of role players. So I guess kind of looking at this roster, I don't know necessarily if I can say like which guy is like the most likely to be moved.
Mm-hmm.
Because again with Detroit, I feel like they're probably going to try to keep some of these veterans. But again, if a team is willing to give up something for one of those guys, I'm sure they'd be willing to listen. But I don't know if I had to guess, like it would. I don't know if Bogdanovich is going to get moved at this point because I don't know if he has as much value as he did last year. I think he has. I think the last year of his deal, like very little of it is guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a team might be willing to do that just because it's another veteran. But I guess if I had to kind of pick which guys may get moved, it would probably be either him, or Burks, or Monte Morris. I just don't know if the other guys are going to be likely to get moved, right? Like Gallinari, maybe, but like I don't know. I mean, I feel like there may be some other pieces that some teams may probably prefer to have,
Sure.
versus like the other guys. I think you may feel more utility with those other guys. So those are probably the three guys I would look at: Morris, Bogdanovich, and then Alec Burks, right? And then I guess Isaiah Stewart as well, because I think there's going to be a team that's going to talk themselves into we need another big guy, even though he's not very tall, right? He's like what 6'8",
Six
which
eight.
is
Yeah.
pretty undersized, for a big. I know he's playing the four a lot in Detroit, but he's really more so of like a five, right? So like a team like an Oklahoma City, right? If they can't get some of these other bigs out there, maybe they're like, let's just get Isaiah Stewart, let's just get a big guy who's willing to battle and rebound. And then, of course, Alec Burks, right? Kind of like a guard wing type guy. And then Monte Morris, a backup point guard. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I'm more on the line of Killian Hayes. I think Killian Hayes is definitely going to be on the move. I think they will be honoring his trade request. I would love him in DC, actually. We can maybe work out a deal where it's like Killian Hayes for Johnny Davis, something like that. Two players of the same pretty much caliber. But I'm just trying to be funny. But regardless, I think we'll probably be looking at Killian Hayes being on the move. Maybe James Wiseman, not too sure. But it seems like Detroit may have, found some hope in James Wiseman. Who knows, though? I also agree with you on Isaiah Stewart as well. I think that's definitely a name to watch because I think their core is probably going to stay the same, with Cade Cunningham, Jalen Duren, all those guys, Asor, obviously. So I think they're fine in that regard, but yeah, it seems like they're probably going to be moving on from pretty much the entire roster potentially. I think everybody on this roster except for like the core guys has potential to be moved, like you were saying. Monte Morris for sure. I know they had recently acquired Muscala and Gallinari, so I don't really know what their plans are for those guys, but yeah, like I don't know. This is just a hodgepodge of mess. I really hate looking at the Detroit roster, but those would be my guesses for who's going to be moved on from.
Yeah, and then just to point out, I know with Stewart he's got an ankle injury, so he's supposed to be out for a little bit. So he might be back. I don't know, probably like in a couple. I think it was like 10 to 14 days.
Yeah.
I think that was announced like right at the beginning of this month, so he may be back like mid-February or whatever.
Sure.
So pretty much like he'll be ready in time, to go for whatever team he goes to if he does. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And then, moving on to, the Wizards, right? Obviously, they've been in a lot of rumors lately, right, with a number of guys on the roster. Obviously you look at their situation, right? You don't really have, like right now, like a ton of like young blue chip guys, I guess. You have some, but I feel like most of those guys are probably going to stay. It's probably, again, going to be a situation where more of the veteran guys are on the way, out of Washington, right? So say like, Tyus Jones, or Kyle Kuzma, right? Maybe Gafford, maybe Shamit gets another shot somewhere else. DeLon Wright, right, as like a, a defensive minded guard.
Yeah.
So those guys, right? Whereas, other guys, right, say like Bilal Coulibaly, I don't think he's going anywhere. They just drafted him, right? Abdi, I don't think would go anywhere. Kispert, maybe, but I don't feel like we've heard a whole lot about, like teams saying like, yeah, we want this guy. I mean, he's a good shooter. But still it doesn't seem like there's like a huge appetite. But again, it's not like he's, a crazy player. So but regardless, yeah, I think like in terms of the most likely, I feel like it may be Jones, Tyus Jones. Like if a team talks themselves into a backup point guard, I don't necessarily believe that he's gonna go for multiple firsts or maybe even one. I feel like the asking price will probably end up coming down if he gets moved, to maybe like seconds or something like that. Kuzma, I know he's obviously been in rumors as well, right? Again, I feel like it's another situation similar to Jones, although he's, a higher caliber of player, but another situation where the asking price will probably come down if he does get moved, right? Like, I don't see him going for multiple firsts, even though he's a good player, but, I don't think a team's going to do that. Gafford, I don't know, because, like, there's not really many other centers on this roster. So unless they're just comfortable with, once again, having one center, except it'd be Marvin Bagley, except for Gafford, I guess maybe they could do that, but I don't know, because, he doesn't make a lot of money, but, again, there's going to be a lot of teams that I think could talk themselves into the idea of, getting another backup center. I know he's a little more on the expensive side compared to some of these other bigs, but, still he's a solid backup big man. So if I had to guess, yeah, I probably would say Tyus Jones, right? So any team that needs a backup point guard, right? Maybe like a Minnesota, or I don't know if they have the assets to do it, but maybe like a Phoenix if they think so, unless they're just comfortable, with their big three just kind of making all the plays, or somebody like that, right? Teams like that, that's where he would probably be added. And then Kuzma, right? We've heard rumors about teams like Dallas, being interested in, right? Like, obviously these teams that are thinking of like, let's get, like a versatile forward, right? Even though Kuzma's probably more of a 4 than a 3.
Yeah.
But, again, the fact that he can do multiple things, right, can help, he can help in a lot of ways. So I feel like I would probably still put him as a little less likely than, say, Tyus Jones just because of the money. But, I could see him being moved if a team, is willing to do something. It's just a matter of like, like what's the lowest that the Wizards would be okay with doing that? You know what I mean? Where it's
Sure.
like, let's say if a team gives like one first, or maybe it's like, and it's like heavily protected, or if it's like multiple seconds, right? Like, what's the minimum that the Wizards would be okay with, for Kuzma getting moved? Because again, he's a good enough player where you probably don't want to just trade him for peanuts. But at the same time, how much is the team willing to give up for him? I don't know. So that's why I would probably say most likely is Tyus Jones. And then after that, probably, put Kuzma, Gafford, and Shamit like in a similar tier. Just because again, I could see somebody talking themselves into any of those guys. But probably, like I said, Tyus Jones and then Kuzma.
Yeah, I would go with Tyus Jones. I think that's definitely the name to watch for sure. Agreeing with you. I've heard a lot of rumors that he's probably going to go for multiple second round picks. That's what I've heard. The rumblings are surrounding him. I'm also looking at Johnny Davis. I think they're probably going to move on from him as well. I know he doesn't probably have a lot of value, but he doesn't really do much when he's on the court. So I think that'll be more of like a salary thing. Kyle Kuzma, I think that should be intriguing. Like you said, heard Dallas. That should be really intriguing because I heard Dallas is prioritizing, I think, power forwards over small forwards, which is kind
Right.
of a sign and a little bit of a hint maybe that they're looking for Kuzma. So that should be very, very interesting. And I've also heard the Mavs are pursuing PJ Washington, which we'll get into
Yeah.
later.
Right.
I think the Corey Kispert trade stuff has kind of died down. I know early on, like a lot of people were like, yeah, he's probably gone, but I think
Yeah.
he's kind of taken that role that Jordan Poole was supposed to fulfill and just be like the pure scorer on this team outside of Kyle Kuzma. So I don't think he's going anywhere. Not that he's going to be like a future piece or anything, but for
Right.
this season, I just don't think they're going to move on from him. I think
Yeah.
it's going to be really mainly Tyus Jones and Kyle Kuzma who I'm looking at. Because I
Right.
think the core, they're not going to move on from Avdia or Koulibaly at all. I think those two
No.
are pretty much set in stone. It would be
Yeah, they
intriguing
just
to see
extended
what.
out.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be kind of intriguing to see what kind of return value you could get for Gafford. I think if you get the right number or the right player or something like that, or a certain amount of picks, I think you could probably live with getting rid of Gafford because, I mean, it's not like we're going to be winning any more games or anything like that. So, you may be able to live with Marvin Bagley being your primary and only center on the entire roster. Wouldn't be the first time. And then also going down the line, DeLon Wright, I think that's also a name to potentially watch because I think he does add some sort of
Right.
value on the defensive end. And then Shamit, we already know what his game is, pretty much pure shooter scorer, I guess, if that's what you want to call him. Yeah, it's kind of similar thing with Detroit where it's like the core is there, I guess, or parts of the core are there, but everybody else is pretty much fair game.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with Kispert, I think it's more so like a lot of people talked about like, yeah, the Wizards should try to move him more so than like we've actually heard rumors about him. Because
Exactly.
like you said, he is, even though he's not quite as young as some of the other guys. I mean, but at the same time, he's like what 24, so it's not like he's a senior citizen. So,
Yeah, yeah.
and not even a veteran, right?
No,
Like he's in his third season. I think it's more so like, say if you're the Wizards, right? Like next off season, you'd have to decide whether or not you're going to extend him or not.
exactly.
So,
And it's like he's pretty
they
much
all
just a pure scorer slash shooter, honestly.
right. Yeah. So, yeah. So that's what I'm thinking. Because again, like it's a little bit different from Detroit because I think Kuzma is probably a higher tier player than any of the most likely to get moved guys on
Absolutely.
Detroit. But at the same time, after Kuzma, right, then it drops off because then it's guys that are more so like role players, guys that probably would come off the bench. So
Yeah, I would definitely see Kuzma going for a first round. Only one, though, not multiple. I think that rumor has just been kind of squashed.
right. Yeah, I think that's another one of those things where like the Wizards were putting that out there, and then probably no one was like, yeah, nobody's doing that, and then they were like,
Exactly.
oh, all right, we'll do one,
Yeah,
and then and then maybe it'll stay at one or drop to seconds. We'll see.
yeah.
So then moving on, Charlotte, right? That's another team, that's had a lot of names and rumors going around, right? Obviously, they recently did the Terry Rozier deal, right, where they sent him to Miami for Kyle Lowry, and a future first. So obviously, their roster is intriguing in the sense of like, because it seems very clear that they're kind of okay with kind of tearing it down and doing a rebuild, right? There's not a whole lot of guys on this roster that I think they would consider untouchable, right? I would assume LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller, but after that, I think everyone else is probably fair game, right? And that would include guys like PJ Washington, who you already
Agreed.
mentioned, right? That's a guy, who's kind of like a semi stretch 4 or 5 small ball type big. His three hasn't been as good this year, right? 6'7", 230, but he's a decent athlete, so he could probably still help out a team, that like needs a little more rotational front court help. Like you mentioned, Dallas, that was a team. Or Oklahoma City, could they do something like that? Or even I don't know, like a Golden State, although like their name, there's been stuff kind of going around that they may not do a whole lot. We'll see, but pretty much him. Miles Bridges is another interesting one, right? Because we've heard rumors about, teams like Phoenix, which I think most people have said is kind of the strongest one, and a couple others, right? Tying their names to them. And obviously, this is kind of like, sort of like the Kevin Porter Jr. situation where a team is going to, I guess, buy low on a guy whose stock is kind of low, not because he's a bad player, but because of his off the court stuff.
Yeah.
Right where Oklahoma City was able to get, draft compensation for taking on Kevin Porter Jr., and then they cut him. But in this case, obviously, Bridges would be going to another team to play. It's a gamble, right? Obviously, because he's on the qualifying offer, so then he becomes an unrestricted free agent without Bird, right? So whoever trades for him will probably have to be prepared to maybe not be able to bring him back, but if he can help you out, then we'll see. He might end up getting moved. And then after that, I mean, the other guys I feel like are probably more likely to be like buyout candidates, right? Like a Kyle Lowry, or a Gordon Hayward. I know Mark Stein mentioned the idea of Gordon Hayward potentially just being a guy that they end up re-signing, which would be interesting.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Not something not what I would have expected, but
Mm-mm.
it's something. And then Lowry, I think it sounds more so likely that if he doesn't get traded, which I don't think he will, he'll get bought out. So outside of that, right? I mean, Mark Williams, right? I would think he would probably be closer to that untouchable tier. Not that he is untouchable, but like they're not looking to move him. Maybe a Nick Richards, right? Who's like a backup center, right? Again, another team that would be okay. Like if another team is okay with having a backup big man for cheap, right? 7-footer. And then after that, then it's some young guys that are just like okay, or just like not really all that great, right? Like James Bouknight, or Nick Smith Jr., who they just drafted, so I don't think he's going anywhere. I guess maybe Cody Martin could be another trade candidate, but again, I don't know how many teams are knocking on the door for that. So it's a little bit different because I don't think there's quite as many guys, but the ones at the top, I think are are kind of intriguing because again, like with the Bridges, again he's a high tier player, but obviously there's off the court stuff going on, so that kind of changes his stock. And then obviously whoever trades for him may not be able to keep him unless it's like a team that trades for him that has cap space. But most of those teams aren't really looking to contend right now. Those are some of the weaker teams like a Detroit,
Yeah.
or somebody else like that, right? Like I think Charlotte will have cap space, but if they trade him, obviously they're not bringing him back. So
Yeah, for sure. I
um,
agree pretty much with everything. I would say number one is Miles Bridges. I think that's definitely going to be a guy that's going to be on the move. I've heard intriguing things regarding Phoenix, and then also the Lakers. I heard that's also a rumor. I think that was from Brian Windhorst. So that should be intriguing to see what kind of offers they're going to be fielding for him. And then also, like you were saying, PJ Washington. I think it would be interesting to see if Dallas takes a swing at Kuzma, and then if they miss, they just pick up PJ Washington or something like that. So that's kind of like the way that I'm looking at this Charlotte roster right now. Maybe even a guy like Ish Smith. I don't know. That would be intriguing because I think he could be a decent backup for some teams. It all depends on who's really going to be looking to buy in on these guys. But yeah, I think Charlotte's in a decent situation where they can kind of just, I guess, kickstart the rebuild and start by moving Miles Bridges and PJ Washington. I think that's a solid start.
yeah, I mean, and because again, like the other guys are more so just again rotational pieces.
Yeah.
Like again, like a Nick Richards is probably a backup center somewhere.
Yeah.
Or Cody Martin is probably like a backup wing somewhere, right? Like you said, some of those guys are not going to be the first. Other than I don't think there's a lot of the guys on this roster that are going to be teams' first choices. But like you said, if the other ones fall through, then they may be like a plan B or C or D or whatever.
Yeah.
And then moving on, right? Another team, right, is the Toronto Raptors. Obviously, they are already made, a couple of trades, but they still have a couple of guys, left on the roster that teams may be interested in. Because again, the young guys, Scotty Barnes, obviously untouchable, right? They just traded for Barrett and Quickly, so they're not going anywhere. Grady Dick they just drafted, so I'd imagine he's probably not going anywhere. Not that he's untouchable, but I
Yeah.
don't think he's going anywhere. So that pretty much leaves some of these other, veteran-ish guys, right? So say like a Dennis Schroeder, Gary Trent Jr., Bruce Brown, obviously I think is probably the biggest name, right? In the sense of that's the guy that they just traded for from Indiana, right? So I would imagine they're going to be looking to flip him. And obviously we know what he can do. He can help out a lot of teams on both ends of the floor. But he does make 22 million or whatever, right? So that means whoever trades for him is going to have to give up something. And then it's also the next year is a team option. So you have two options where you could either decline that option and then re-sign him on presumably a cheaper deal like per year, or you end up accepting the team option and then just having him once again on a 20 whatever $1 million deal. I would assume I think most teams would probably end up doing the former just because I think a lot of those teams that are going to trade from are going to be more mindful of avoiding, whatever the next tier of the tax is for them. So, like I said, I think he would obviously be the number one guy, and then after that, probably Schroeder and Gary Trent. Right? Again, same thing with Tyus Jones. Where any team that's looking for a backup point guard, right? You could look at him. Obviously, he's not your typical backup point guard because he's more of a scoring, offensive minded backup point guard as opposed to like a playmaking one. We know he can be pretty feisty and competitive on the defensive end. So we've seen it. We saw it last year and years prior. And then Gary Trent Jr. Right is again he's a pretty good outside shooter. I guess I don't think he's a great defender, right? But he's got like a strong frame. He's a decent athlete, so he could still probably help out another team and he might be a better option than what teams already have. So again, if you're looking for a shooter, Gary Trent Jr., you're looking for a backup point guard that can kind of play both ends of the floor, then Dennis Schroeder. And then after that, right, Bruce Brown, right? Who's more of a, I guess, versatile two-way player.
Yeah, the main two guys that I'm looking at here, definitely Bruce Brown. I think you hit on all the points with him. It would be intriguing because I think he's probably going to be, one of the more sought out guys, I think, of this deadline, because I just don't really foresee him being like a long-term piece for Toronto. So I think they're going to be, trying to get rid of him. And then also Schroeder as well. I think that's a decent piece that teams should be looking to acquire because I think he's kind of an anomaly in a sense, where he's so 50-50. That's his main problem is he'll have like an amazing game and then he'll have another game where it's like, okay, maybe he shouldn't really be starting or, in the rotation at all. So that's kind of the caliber that he's in. But regardless, I think, he does have some skills that people would probably want, especially on the defensive end, being one of those, like I think we've been saying this for, a year now, point of attack guards where, he can really cause some trouble and wreak some havoc. So I think he does have some value as well. And then Gary Trent Jr., like you were saying, he's a decent outside shooter. It's just this roster is kind of interesting because they do have a ton of vets, but they're on the older side, and I don't think they'll be moved. And then also they have some guys who are hurt, and then obviously they have the main pieces and the core pieces of their roster, and Scotty Barnes, RJ, Grady Dick, who are definitely not going to be moved. So I think it is intriguing to see who they're going to move, but I would definitely look at Schroeder and Bruce Brown for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we haven't done it yet, but like, do we have any predictions on like where any of these guys are going to go so far? Because Bruce Brown, it feels kind of New York. He seems like he might be New York bound. I'm not saying he is, but I know that they've been talking about it a lot. I think he's mentioned the connection he had with Tom Thibodeau. So I feel like that's probably where he goes. But some of the other ones, it's a little bit harder, I think, to like just flat out predict because it's just like there's not as many like rumors in terms of like what teams are interested in them. Like I don't think I've heard a whole lot of rumors about a bunch of teams interested in Dennis Schroeder. I know
Right.
I think in a while ago I think I heard like say the Lakers were interested in him, but outside of that, I haven't heard about him from any other teams. So it's like
Yeah,
that's why it's
I
kind of
think New
hard.
York is going to be the one. I think they're going to be the one to probably buy in on that, and I think they should. Considering where they are in the
Right.
standings, I think they could. There's room for improvement. Like they're playing out of
Yeah.
their minds, but there is room for improvement because I think Anunoby missed the last game against the Lakers. So
There's
that kind of
multiple teams.
so that hurt them a lot. And
Randall
then
out.
Randall, yep. So there are, and then obviously Mitchell Robinson. So that, doesn't help. So I think they do need kind of a spark because you don't want to fall too bad, and I don't think Brunson can completely carry the load by himself. So you do need some impact players. And I think Bruce Brown is probably the top candidate.
Yeah. Right, and that would probably end up being like Fournier, and then
Yeah.
some other filler salary, and like whatever else they need, like a first or seconds or whatever, something like that is what I would guess. And then I guess before we go to the next team, like just quick ones like PJ Washington, Miles Bridges,
Yeah.
Jones, and Kuzma. Do we think we know where they might go, or are we just kind of like,
I would say Kuz for Dallas, probably. That's where I'd be eyeing him. Maybe Dallas or Sacramento. I've been really pushing that Kuzma to Sacramento narrative. I don't know why. It just feels like a match made in heaven. And then I believe, I don't know. For the other guys, it's a little bit more difficult. I think maybe PJ Washington, that could also be, like I said, the Mavs backup option, or, maybe they take a swing. Like you were saying, OKC, that would be intriguing. I think that would be really fun to watch him be in that system. And yeah, that's pretty much all I can really think of. Maybe Miles Bridges to Miles Bridges maybe to Phoenix, LA. I mean, I'm intrigued. The LA one has piqued my interest. But the Phoenix one would also be pretty interesting because I think they do and are lacking some, I guess.
It just seems like that's the one that everybody's been, talking about as of late. So that's why it feels like that's the one that might happen.
Yeah. And then Tyus Jones, that's the tricky one because I think he has a lot of suitors. Because I think there are a lot of teams in that upper echelon that do need a backup point guard. But I think the one that you mentioned earlier, definitely Minnesota, that would be really, really cool to see. Because I think he kind of fits into that archetype that they need, where it's like some guy who's like, he's like, because a lot of people have regarded Tyus Jones as one of the better backups in the league, and I wholeheartedly agree. And a lot of people have also said that he's kind of like a coach on the floor. So I think they do need to calm down that second unit up there in Minnesota. So I think Tyus Jones would be a perfect fit there.
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking. I think I'm not saying he's going to go there, but I feel like that one seems like something that could really happen, unless he's like thrown into a bigger deal. Because again, we haven't talked about these other ones yet. As we'll get into these other teams, but there's always the possibility of 3-team deals as well, even though they don't happen a whole lot always, but they could. So
yeah, or who knows? A star might all of a sudden just get traded somewhere, and he's a part of that deal.
Right. Yeah. And then next up, the Brooklyn Nets. This is another roster, right, that has kind of some interesting pieces on it, right? Obviously their name have been in rumors a lot, right? Mikal Bridges is a name that's come up. I don't think he's going to go anywhere, right? All we've heard is that Brooklyn has turned down, numerous trade offers, for Mikal Bridges, and it's teams that are willing to give up multiple first-round picks, and they haven't accepted any of these. So it seems like he's probably not going anywhere. Royce O'Neal, right? That's a veteran guy, right? He plays the forward spot, but he's a little undersized. He's like 6'4". Spencer Dinwiddie, right? Obviously as a guard. Dorian Finney-Smith, right? That's a name that's come up a ton. And then after that, right? Just other bench guys, right? Like like Dennis Smith Jr., Lonnie Walker. But those guys, because their contracts are so small, they're probably going to stay. Nick Claxton is another one where I think he's due for, a new contract, right? So, you kind of wonder whether or not Brooklyn just decides to keep him and, pay him his money in the offseason, or do they just decide to move him now and let some other team, kind of handle it. But in terms of most likely guys, I'd probably say, like Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, Spencer Dinwiddie, because again, they're just those type of players. We've heard so many rumors about them that it feels like those guys are bound to be moved. Elsewhere. I don't necessarily know specifically where they would go. But any team that needs a 3-and-D wing, and then obviously any team that may need a backup point guard. I know there's been a lot of talk about, say, Spencer Dinwiddie being like a guy in a 3-team deal that's sort of like a salary that's just flipped to another team.
Right.
Where I know they've talked about what the DeJounte Murray thing, right? Let's say Dinwiddie ends up in Atlanta as an expiring contract or something like that, right? As opposed to him having a lot of interest from, contending teams. So something like that. But those are the 3 guys I would probably look at in terms of the most likely to be moved, just because, again, they're all veterans that play positions that teams probably would want. But I think the one that teams would probably want the most is Dorian Finney-Smith, just because again he's a 3-and-D wing, and I know this season has been a little more up and down, but he is shooting 38% from three. He's been hurt somewhat as of late, but regardless, it could also just be maybe he's kind of hurt, but not hurt that badly, and they're just kind of protecting him so that way he'll be able to be traded. I don't know. Not throwing out any conspiracies or anything like that, but that's what I'm thinking of those three guys.
Yeah. I would definitely say the same. It is kind of interesting. I think the Nets are one of the more confusing teams because you would think, with the roster that they have, they should probably be starting their rebuild, right? But they doesn't really seem like they are because,
they don't have their own pick.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the tough part. But it's really tough because I think, they have those three guys in Royce O'Neal, Claxton, and then Dinwiddie, but it's tough. And then also, I think Dorian Finney-Smith, they turned down the whole 2 first-round picks for Dorian Finney-Smith. So that's,
right.
That tells you all you really need to know. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of movement for them. And I've also heard, like, Dinwiddie, there's no market for him, which is kind of wild because I don't think he's been playing the best basketball of his career.
And I think that might be why, because I think some people think that he's kind of like
washed.
Yeah, well, not even washed, but some people think he's kind of like quitting on Brooklyn. Like I thought there was something that said like he was like on a strike or something like that. But like you said, he's not had a great season regardless. So that would make some teams a little bit concerned. And he had the ACL injury a few years ago, so maybe he's just not quite as consistent. But he sometimes does have games where he blows up. But again, I still would say I think DFS is the guy that's probably the most sought after.
Yeah, which is, I think, rightfully so. I think he's a really good player. And then Claxton, that's kind of tricky because it's a lot of money. The $100 million deal, that's a lot of money for somebody of his caliber. And I think he deserves it for sure. But I just don't really know how that's going to work out. And I know, like, a lot of people are saying, they're expecting him to stay in Brooklyn beyond the deadline, which I think is the right thing. And they can always do like a sign and trade, I guess, in the summer. So it is intriguing, but for me, I would probably go with Dorian Finney-Smith. I think that's probably going to be the number one guy to be moved. There's some people like, I don't know. It's hard to really gauge what this team really wants to do sometimes, but they do have some interesting pieces. But the fact that they are rejecting certain offers tells me that they really do value their guys a lot.
Yeah. I mean, my thought process is just like, the record is not that great. And like, I don't think there's a move out there that makes them, that moves them into the next tier. And I don't even know if they're good enough or like to move into the next tier anyways. So I think you may have to kind of look at this as a lost season, trade some of those guys to get something back, and then just kind of like be like, oh, well, this sucks because we don't have our first, but maybe we can figure something out in the off season.
Yeah.
So, and then next up, another team that's been in the news a lot, the Atlanta Hawks, right? Obviously, this is a team that's, got a lot riding on it, I guess. It's a strange team for sure, right? Obviously their record was pretty bad, a little while ago, but they've won 3-4 games in a row to get to 22-27, which is still not great.
Yeah.
But I guess it's something, maybe. I don't know.
I guess.
But either way, regardless, their names have been in the news a lot, right? Mainly because of DeJounte Murray. Some of their other guys have been mentioned in rumors as well. Say like Bogdanovich, Clint Capella. I believe also, was there anyone else? Not like in terms of guys that teams would want. I think it more so like salary filler because I don't think DeAndre Hunter's name was ever mentioned. So, unless, not really, but either way, yeah. I think his name's been mentioned.
Yeah.
But like, I don't think anybody's probably going to trade for him. But you never know.
Yeah.
And he just came back.
Too crazy.
Yeah, and he just came back from injury. But in terms of the guys here, obviously, the name that's been mentioned so much is DeJounte Murray, and it's been kind of up and down, right? Where it's like, we heard, a few weeks ago, right, that he was probably going to get moved and that there were a ton of teams interested, and now we've heard a lot less as of late. And in fact, to this point now, we've only really heard like 1 or 2 teams. Obviously, the Lakers, and I think recently they mentioned the Jazz potentially interested in him. Which again, if they're looking for a point guard, I guess, okay, interesting. Yeah. But regardless, I feel like he's probably the main guy, and then anyone else on the roster, is like, I feel like, some guys may get swapped, like in terms of like salary dumps or something like that. But I don't really think that Clint Capella or Bogdanovich are probably going to get traded. I mean, I could be wrong, but like if they do, it would be in like a bigger trade where like, we're talking about like DeJounte Murray and another guy going elsewhere for like two, three guys from another team. And I just don't necessarily know if that's going to happen. So I'm going to say probably DeJounte Murray. But at the same time, who knows? Because again, like we've heard a lot about it, but it's also gotten really quiet. So that's going to mean one of two things. It's either that it's not happening, or it means that it could happen, but like there's like, whatever finishing kinks or touches have to be put on the trade, have to be worked out, which, is kind of what we heard, right? Where it's like, it could happen. It's like you need a third team to be willing to take on, D'Angelo Russell's contract or whatever it is. So that's what we've heard. So, but outside of that, like I think Capella and Bogdanovich have value. I just don't necessarily know if a team's actually going to trade for those guys.
Yeah.
Like, because again, I don't think them by themselves a whole lot of teams would probably want. Maybe if you can get two of those three guys, but like again, that's a decent amount of salary to just send out for guys that like, they're fine, but I mean, they're just fine to me.
Yeah, agreed. We've been saying this for a while. They're pretty much the definition of mid, not the players, the teams though, or the Atlanta Hawks, that is. And the guys that I'm really looking at on this roster, firstly, Clint Capella. I think he's probably going to be gone. I think we're probably going to be looking at a team where, they need some size. I think we've hinted at it before. OKC, that would be very intriguing to see if they can field an offer from him. That would be really, really cool to see him fit in that system as well. Because I think, Atlanta has the leeway to kind of figure out what they want to do, especially because they have a Okongwu who's very good.
Tank.
Yeah, exactly. So they can soft tank. And Okongwu's very good. And if you can get back some OKC picks, I think you feel really, really good. With that kind of haul. And then also DeJounte Murray, that's really, really polarizing at this point, I think, because a lot of people have been saying you need to keep him because he has been winning them games and forcing them into winning situations and overtime situations. So shout out to him. He's been balling on another level as of late. But, sometimes that's just not enough. And it would be intriguing to see him go, but it also would kind of sting to give him up but sometimes you do have to bite the bullet where it's like it's not a great move and it didn't really elevate you. It made you worse than what you were prior, because I think prior to this DeJounte Murray trade, I think people were very high on the Hawks. We were like, okay, they might be a contender in the East, but that has not been the case so far, and especially since DeJounte Murray has joined the team. So maybe they do trade him and get back some picks, and I think that would be very smart, because it's not like he's making a crap ton of money. It's not like he's a $40 million player or anything like that. He's making $18 million a year. So I think the contract will be better over time. But I think it would be smart to probably move on from him and just bite the bullet and say you took the L.
And I think that's probably the appeal why, if you're a team, you would want him, because right now he doesn't make a whole lot. And then, he's already been signed to an extension. And even then, by the end of it, it's not like you said, it's not like you're paying him 40 plus million a year. It's like, I think at the end it's around 30-ish. So, which is a lot, but still. So that's what I think. Cause again, like if you trade him, you're not getting back as much as you got or as much as you gave up to get him. Cause they gave up, I think 3 firsts. I don't think you're getting 3 firsts for him. I think it's probably 1 at the most, maybe some type of pick swap. And then like, maybe like a team will throw in a young player, to kind of like make up for the gap or something like that. So I don't know. I feel like he will, but at the same time, you just don't know with Atlanta, because they could also just like at the last second hang on, because they did that with John Collins, right, where they just decided to hang on, and keep him, and then by the time they moved him, his value was super low, so they got nothing back for him, right? So, but then at the same time, they may actually like be smart about it and just decide to move on from him now, because then the longer you wait, well, you're not gonna get too many picks, I don't think, once he makes like 20 plus million a year.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like he's obviously good, but like again, I think you'd rather get him now if you're another team at 17, 18 than at 25 plus. So
yeah, it makes sense to me.
Next up is the Chicago Bulls. Kind of already talked about them, right? Where we mentioned Zach LaVine. Obviously, we're assuming his name is taken out of the trade machine, trade rumors for a lot of guys. Because again, he's hurt, he's not playing this season. They have other guys, right? Like DeMar DeRozan, Alex Caruso, Andre Drummond, guys like that. But, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of an appetite for Chicago to move on from, either DeRozan or Caruso. So, of this group of guys, right? And then obviously Kobe White's played too well, right? You're not going to trade him now.
Yeah.
They just gave him an extension and he's rewarding them by playing really well. So I guess I would probably say most likely is Andre Drummond is, because he's like basically on a minimum contract, which is nothing. So you can move him for very little. You're not going to get back a lot, right? Probably a second or, some other type of, similar tier minimum contract guy. But, you're not looking to get back a whole lot for him anyways. So I feel like he's probably the most likely. But then after that, I don't know if Caruso or DeRozan get moved because we just haven't heard a whole lot about them. We've heard, that teams have checked in on him, right? Like we heard about the Warriors checking in on him recently, and we know other teams are interested, but it doesn't sound like the Bulls really want to do that. It seems like they may be more interested in, kind of just trying to go into the play-in, which, they could do. I guess they're in the play-in right now because they're ninth. And they're probably not going to drop too far past like 10. Obviously the Nets are close because I think they're 11th and they're like a couple games back, but they could realistically make the play-in. But, are they going to be able to win 2 games and get into the playoffs as an 8th seed? I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case because
Right.
I feel like the other play-in teams are probably, better, right? Like the Magic are in the play-in. I think they're better than Chicago. Same with the Miami Heat. So I don't know. I feel like Drummond is probably the most likely, and then after that, if somebody is like really, really, okay with doing it, maybe a team may actually give up a first or two for Caruso. I don't think they will. So if that doesn't happen, like I could see Chicago just being like, we're just not going to trade him. We're just going to do it in the offseason or maybe not even trade him at all. And then DeRozan, I don't know. Because again, we just haven't heard anything about him. So my guess is Drummond, which sounds kind of like a boring-ish trade deadline, but again, the Levine thing kind of changes stuff because now you're not going to be able to move him, so it's probably going to have to be smaller stuff anyway. So I'd say Andre Drummond, any team that needs a backup big man, and again, it's a minimum contract, which is fine,
Yeah.
and that's a lot easier to to pick up than somebody that makes like $8-10 million. Obviously he's got some limitations to him, but he's a very good rebounder. And he has now embraced, I think, the backup veteran big man bench role, which is good, because there was a time where he was a starter. He was an all-star at one point,
Yeah.
and now he's brought into this new role. So
Yeah, he was the face of the franchise for the Detroit Pistons, which is kind of wild. But I guess, looking at this Bulls roster, my main takeaway would definitely be Caruso. I think he's probably one to go. And like you were saying, Drummond as well. And I think a guy that you didn't really mention, but is hurt right now, and I think he's supposed to be out for 2 weeks, is Patrick Williams. I think he's a guy that Chicago is most likely going to be moving on from. He had a lot of praise coming out of college. Some people thought this was more of an overdraft with him. I believe he went, fourth.
I think he was fourth.
Which is crazy to think. That draft was so funny. But regardless, I think he does have some value in terms of defense, but the offense is kind of rough around the edges. But, depending on his health and whatnot, I think it would be intriguing to see if they field any offers for him. But yeah, I think DeRozan's safe. And obviously Zach LaVine is safe due to injury as well. So, I think it's going to be a quiet deadline for the Bulls. But if they do end up moving somebody, it'll definitely be between, Caruso or Drummond.
Yeah. And then moving on, to the next team, and now we're kind of going over to the Western Conference, right? Because we're going to start with the sellers and then kind of work our way up.
Yes.
Now we're at the Spurs, right? So you look at their roster, right? They're 10-40, not very good. It's a mixture, mostly younger guys, but they do have a few veterans on the roster, right? Jetty Osman, as well as Doug McDermott, right? Dougie McBuckets, I think was his nickname. I don't know if people still say that. Devontae Graham, I guess, is on the roster, but I don't think he really plays.
No,
I don't necessarily think he really has a whole lot of interest, around the league. So I don't think they're going to be making too many moves. I mean, obviously it'd be interesting if they were able to get like some random bench point guard from another team, to have like a backup point guard that they could play. So it's not just Trey Jones and then, just other random stuff. But more than likely, in terms of guys who could get moved, like I said, maybe Osman or McDermott, a team that's looking to add either a 3-and-D wing or just like a pure shooter, to their roster. But, I don't know. Like after that, I think it's kind of slim pickings because I feel like most of the other guys are probably guys that the Spurs would rather just keep because they're mainly younger guys.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very quiet Spurs deadline. I don't think they might not make a single move. That wouldn't surprise me if they don't move anybody. But looking at the roster, I think most likely to be moved would definitely be Doug McDermott because you really don't want to move Keldon Johnson, Sohan, or obviously not Wemby or anybody like that. So I think it's going to be very, very quiet for them. But yeah, Doug McDermott is definitely the guy who's probably going to be on the list for me.
Yeah, and I'm not even going to try to predict where those guys go.
Yeah,
So
no, you can't.
yeah. Next up, the Portland Trailblazers, right? Another not so great team. There's I think a few more guys on this roster that I think teams would be interested in. Malcolm Brogdon, I think, is where you got to start, right? Obviously, he's been starting at point guard for them. There's been a lot more noise going on that suggests that they may not want to move him, and maybe some of that is because like maybe they just don't feel like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't play Scoot Henderson, like as many minutes as we can give him, because that may maybe backfire if he has like too much on his plate, because he's been like what the sixth man backup point guard for them behind Brogdon and Simons.
Yeah.
But I do think there are a lot of teams that would want him just because again he's a veteran guard that can do a lot of things offensively, shoots pretty well, decent playmaker. Obviously the issue for him is he gets hurt a lot, so he's injury prone, so that can be a problem because he's missed some time this season.
Hmm.
I think he's played 39 games, so that's not necessarily terrible, right? I mean, they are, if you look at their record, they are 15 and 34, right? So that's what 49 games. So he's missed like 10. So
Yeah.
that's relatively fine, for him. But either way, if you're a team that's looking for like a point guard, backup point guard plus, right? Like potential starter, right? Like that's where you could probably talk yourself into him because again, he could start, for some, for a decent number of teams, right? I know he was the
Yeah.
sixth man for Boston, but he's also at times started. Like I think he started at different points for the Bucks, right?
Yeah,
I think it,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. I don't remember if he started for the Pacers. He might have like I guess before Halliburton he did.
Yeah,
So
yeah, he definitely did. I think there were games and stretches where he would start, and that's kind of like the role that he's always like filled is like if somebody's hurt or maybe if there's
yeah,
a lineup change, he's gonna start.
right. I think his last year in Milwaukee he was the starting guard.
Hmm.
And then in Indiana I think he started full time because he was paid like a starter. Because I remember that's why Milwaukee let him go. Or I guess it was like a sign and trade or whatever. But regardless, um, so yeah, like he could either start or come off the bench, right? Because he can do a lot of different things. His role can fit in pretty well.
Yeah.
I don't know specifically where he goes because again, like the rumors have kind of died down for him as of late, right? I think there was a lot more talk about him initially, but now there isn't. I could still see him getting moved. Just again, it could be one of those scenarios where you know Portland wanted more than what they could realistically get, and now they're going to probably just have to settle. Um, Again, obviously it was kind of funny because initially he was supposed to be a Clipper, right?
Yeah.
Before Harden. And he ended up being a Blazer in the holiday trade, so he could go elsewhere. But I don't think he's probably going to be too many teams' first options. I think it's another situation where it's like if we don't get the guy that we want, right, he could be like a plan B or C. Like, let's say if like LA, right, doesn't get DeJounte Murray, maybe they pivot to Brogdon. Like, I don't think they would, but you just never know, right? Where like maybe they're like, oh, let's get a different look at the guard spot. Or some other team, right? Because again, there's other teams that could use him. But it's just, and he doesn't make a ton of money. But at the same time, it's at a level where you're probably gonna have to give something up. And I don't think any of like the top tier teams are going to be able to do it. Like it would again, or even like a New York, right? Like let's say if you miss out on Bruce Brown, you get Malcolm Brogdon, to get you like more of a reliable, dependable backup option at the guard spot, as opposed to like Miles McBride, who's been playing well for them, right? But you might want a little bit more stability at the guard spot.
Sure.
Behind Brunson, because like you said, you mentioned it as of late, right? Where it's like he could, because they're kind of shorthanded right now, he could run out of gas. And so you'd like to have another guy that can kind of handle and control some of the offense for you so he
Yes.
doesn't have to do it all on his own.
Yeah, agreed. I would definitely start with Malcolm Brogdon on this list. You pretty much explained it. I don't think I really have to go in depth with him. But
Yeah,
another guy that I would look at is definitely Jeremy Grant. That would be intriguing to me. I could potentially see like Philly maybe doing something, or maybe even like Dallas. I don't know. It would be intriguing. I think he has a decent amount of suitors. And it also the positives I guess for Portland would be you get to bring in Jabari Walker and Chris Murray. I guess those would be the younger guys, and you do need to see what you have in terms of the young guys on your roster. And then also, I would also say Matisse Thybulle is another guy that you should be looking out for as well.
Yeah.
He's pretty good on defense, and if he
And he's
does
an
get
improved
that,
shooter.
yeah, if he does, he has been shooting, pretty well this season. So you do have to give him hats off for that. And that was kind of the dark part about his career in Philly was like, he wasn't all that great of a shooter. Sometimes he'd be left open, and then he was kind of like out there, kind of like Roberson, if you remember him on
Oh
OKC.
yeah.
Yeah, back in the day. So that would be my comparison for him. But he's a really, really good defender and now a very good shooter. So I think, he might have some value to some other teams as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and again, his situation is different because he's was a restricted free agent that got matched by Portland, right? I think he signed the offer sheet from Dallas, and then Portland matched it.
Yeah.
And so now if he goes somewhere, I think he has like veto power, so
Hmm.
he's not going somewhere that he doesn't want to go to, which is
Right.
kind of interesting. But
Yeah,
just
it's like
kind
a
of like
no
another,
trade clause mini thing for
yeah,
like role players.
yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, I think that's definitely a guy where it's like again a lot of these guys are kind of guys where it's like if we don't get somebody else, this could be a decent fallback option. Because again, like if he can continue to shoot well, he could help out a lot of teams. Over the course of the season, and then Jeremy Grant, he's on a super long term big contract, right? So I don't necessarily know if he's going to be moved this deadline. It could be like in the off season, or maybe he just stays because again, who knows, but. Robert Williams would have been a candidate, but obviously, a while back he got a season-ending injury, so you got to take his name out because I think before the Rockets traded for Adams, Robert Williams was a name that was mentioned. I mean, if you could have gotten like Robert Williams for what they did with Steven Adams, right? Like I probably would have preferred Robert Williams, but at the same
Agreed.
time, he's got the injury history. But now Adams is banged up. But in fairness, Adams is more of a grizzled veteran than Robert Williams, and he gives you a little bit more size, even though it's not like Robert Williams is tiny, but he is like what 6'9",
Yeah.
and he's got some major injury concerns. Although it's not like Adams doesn't have any of his own, but still, regardless.
Yeah.
And then moving on, the Memphis Grizzlies. I mean, they already did the Adams trade. So, I mean, at this point, I don't know if they really have much else. I mean, obviously Marcus Smart is a name, but it doesn't sound like he's going to go anywhere. Because they gave up, I think, 2 firsts to get him. So I don't, so unless, they're okay with, you know, settling for, multiple seconds or one protected first, they're not going to get back the same that you gave up. They already traded Adams, right? So that's obviously done. None of their core guys, right? They're not going anywhere, right? Like Ja, Desmond Bain, Jaren Jackson, all those guys are, have been paid and extended, so they're not going anywhere. So after that, right? Maybe one of those other guys like a Luke Kennard, or somebody like that. But after that, like I don't think any of these other guys are probably going to go anywhere. I feel like they don't really have much else that they can really do or necessarily want to do other than, like I said, the Luke Kennard thing, because the season's pretty much shot. So you just kind of, you just cut your losses and, be ready for the draft, in the off season and, either draft the guy you want or you trade the pick.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think they kind of made their move, and that was the Steven Adams one. So I think it'll be a quiet one for them, kind of similar to San Antonio, where it's like, you don't really want to give up anybody except for maybe a guy like Luke Kennard, like you said. And I guess the similarity would be Doug McDermott. I guess those two are, on the same level.
Yeah. So now that we kind of covered the sellers, right now I guess we can kind of move on into the other teams, like in terms of the things they need, right? This one I think will be a little bit more brief, right? Because we're not talking about like actual names,
Yeah.
For all of them. But I guess we'll kind of start off in the East, and again we'll work our way up, right? So obviously we're going into the top 8, right? So like that's the Orlando Magic and up territory. So in terms of the Magic, I mean, again, they are 26 and 23, right? So obviously, they're sitting 8th in the Eastern Conference, so they're in the play-in. It sounds like that they're, and I think you can see it, right, that they need, some more point guard help, right? Obviously they have a lot of guards, right? But none of them are necessarily like, game managing point guards. They're more so like, either I score or I, defend at a really high level, right? You don't really have like, like a more game managing one. And also like not all of them are great outside shooters, right? Like Fultz is not a great outside shooter. Anthony's fine, right? But again, he's more of like a hustle energy guy. Same with Suggs, right? Anthony Black is probably just not ready at this point.
Yeah.
So, that's where you're probably looking at a veteran point guard. I know there had been something thrown out there about maybe they trade for Chris Paul. which would be kind of weird.
Yeah, I
You
don't
know,
think Chris Paul would be too happy about that one.
yeah, I mean, I'm curious to even see like what you would even give up, in terms of the salaries, right? Because I mean, like, you know, I know they've had guys like say Wendell Carter Jr. in rumors, or like Gary Harris or something like that. Like, I can't imagine you give up like one of your core guys, to do that. But again, I don't know. I feel like there's probably better options. I know they've also mentioned Lowry. I mean, I would probably prefer to have Chris Paul at this point than Lowry. But either way, which one is more gettable, right? Because like, let's say if Lowry gets bought out, maybe he wouldn't mind coming to Orlando because he's already won a title, unless he just wants to go to another contender for a chance to win again. Because I don't know his motive. So because we've heard him being tied to Philly, but I think point guard makes a lot of sense because I think in terms of your forwards, you got some pretty good ones there. So I mean, I don't think you have to do much there. So pretty much point guard. And either way, right? Like it's a young team, so it's like if they kind of stay like in that play-in spot and don't move up much more than that, like the season's not a failure for them the way that it might be some of these other teams.
Yeah, for sure, agreed. And I kind of think that they're in a interesting spot where they can also be a seller a little bit too, because I think they have some needs, and I think one of them is definitely 3-point shooting. We thought that had kind of been, I guess, solved, but it wasn't clearly. So it kind of would be interesting to see, what they do with their expiring contracts. I think Gary Harris is expiring, and then also Markelle Fultz. So that could also be flipped for future compensation. But it wouldn't surprise me if they go out and really look for like you said, a game managing point guard, an on court coach, maybe somebody like Tyus Jones. Who knows? It would be very intriguing
Right.
to see what they really shoot for. But it definitely needs to be point guard, and definitely needs to be somebody who can shoot the basketball at an efficient rate.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. And again, I probably wouldn't like throw too many guys away just to do something like
Exactly.
that. And then the Miami Heat, right? They're 26, 23. I don't really think there's a whole lot they can really change at this point unless it's like a guy that's a significant part of the rotation, right? So like either Duncan Robinson, or like Tyler Hero or somebody like that. Because, none of the other guys on that roster, that are playing, right, make a whole lot of money in the sense of like you're not getting a whole lot for like Caleb Martin because I don't think he makes a ton, right? Like Thomas Bryant, that's a minimum contract, right? Jovic, right? That's a first round draft pick. Um, a lot of those other guys. So I don't necessarily. I feel like the Rozier move kind of was their move. I
Hmm.
know they. I know there was like the funny thing about they should move Jimmy Butler, but
Yeah.
I feel like they're probably kind of done unless they decide to actually like do like one of those shocker where did that come from moves and move like Hero or somebody like that. But it would be nice if they could probably add a little bit more size because I know like they're a weird offensive team anyways, and that's just kind of how the makeup of their roster is. But when you have that and you're kind of small, that kind of hurts too. Even though they can be feisty and competitive and sometimes defend, but I don't know. Like they like the size I think is kind of more important because I feel like it's kind of hard to just rely on just Bam. And even like sometimes his offense, even though he's had a really good season, like he's got limitations to his game. So just being able to have a little bit more size out there, either potentially alongside of him in some lineups or off the bench, that would help. As opposed to like just Kevin Love being your backup center.
Right. Yeah, agreed wholeheartedly. And they're such an intriguing team because it seems like no matter what the roster is, they're going to find a way to compete. So I'm not like super worried about them, and I don't think it's like a crazy
Yeah.
issue if they don't do
It's another
anything.
one of those teams where I think like in the playoffs, you'll see a better version of them than what we've seen in the regular
Yeah,
season.
they tend to elevate during that time, but it would be intriguing if they do go up or go out for like a backup big man, like say I don't know Kelly Olynyk or something like that.
Right.
Where like the Jazz are kind of looking to have somewhat of a fire sale.
Yeah, exactly. And then moving on, the Pacers, right? That's another team that already kind of made, their big move. They got Siakam. After that, right? Like I think, a guy that, it may not have seemed like they were going to move at one point, but it kind of started, where in the beginning of the season, he had rumors around him. His Buddy Hield, he's not playing quite as much, as of late. And again, like now he's not even starting because he was starting at one point, and now he's coming off the bench. I know he's had like some games here and there, but like, he also had a couple stretches where he's playing like 14 minutes, 19 minutes. Before tonight, he had some 28, 36-minute games, but that was because guys like Halliburton and others were out. And now that those guys are back, I don't think he's going to play as much. Just because now they're starting Nemhard and Neesmith together. So I feel like he's a guy that could potentially be moved. And then outside of that, right? Like, I mean, I don't think they're going to move their young guys. Like some of them may just depend on the matchup where they may just like have some guys just some games not play a whole lot and then other games they will. But I don't really see them probably making any more like big moves. But like maybe if you move like Buddy Hield and bring in more of like a defensive minded guy or something like that, or another wing or forward or backup center, maybe that's fine. But I don't know. I feel like the Siakam move kind of was their big move. I don't know if they do much else.
Yeah, it seems like their rumors have kind of died down post Siakam stuff because I know that they were kind of intrigued with Andrew Wiggins and I think also Jonathan Kuminga previously, but I think that's probably died down at this point. So I'm probably looking for them to potentially really just move on from probably Buddy Hield. I don't know. Like that's it's a tough situation, but I think they're going to be one of those teams where they're a little bit more quiet because I think they did make one of the bigger splashes, if not the biggest splash. In this trade approaching the trade deadline. So I think they're
Yeah.
going to be quiet.
Sixers, right? We already kind of talked about them, so we don't have to say too much more. Obviously, they have the opportunity to either make a swing and grab somebody, but again, doesn't sound like there's really anybody available that's like a big star. So they probably might as well just see if they can, make some smaller moves, get some more two-way guys, maybe get a backup point guard. Maybe that point guard is Kyle Lowry, like in the buyout market. But I don't think they end up doing anything like really significant in terms of a move because again, it just doesn't sound like it's out there. And we don't know when Embiid's going to be back. So at that point, I mean, I don't think they're going to fall too much further because they've kind of built up enough wins where it's like they're probably not going to fall much further than like 6.
Yeah.
Unless one of those teams below them goes on a crazy win streak. But I mean, we both kind of felt that they probably shouldn't do anything like big anyways because that'd be kind of dangerous.
Hmm.
But now I feel like they're probably just going to definitely do something more rotational. Like I
Yeah.
don't, unless like somebody comes out of nowhere, like I don't really think they're going to do too much.
Yeah, I feel like they might be like a suitor for, say, I don't know, Tyus Jones, like you're saying, backup point guard. Not sure how likely that's going to be. Yeah, like you said, two-way wings. Like they kind of need a little bit of everything, especially with Embiid being out. That's the main thing that hurts them. If Embiid was still here, I think we'd be having a different conversation for sure. But they're only sitting at 30 wins and 18 losses, so they kind of have a little bit of a comfortable cushion, like you were saying. So but time is of the essence, and I think they do need to act swiftly and make a decision. And I think they could potentially be quiet. I would go on the cautious side of things and probably just save all your stuff for the offseason, honestly.
Yeah. And then the Knicks, we kind of already talked about them where we pretty much said like get Bruce Brown if you can.
Yes.
Because I don't really think there's a whole lot else really that you really have to do. I mean, it's already a really good team. I'm not saying Bruce Brown makes you a championship contender, but they're really good when they're healthy, and if they can get him and then hopefully get Randall back, maybe you get Mitchell Robinson back right at the end. Who knows? I mean, then you're doing really good for yourself. So
Yeah.
I don't think they have to do much more than that. Because we already talked about them, and then with the Cavs, right there. They're third in the East, which is really, really good. They've been on a tear as of late, and that was, even when they had multiple guys out. I still don't think that they're going to do a whole lot at the trade deadline. I don't think they're going to move Donovan Mitchell. Obviously, I never thought they were going to, anyways. And obviously, because they've been winning, there's no real need to now anymore. Jared Allen, right? That was a guy that could potentially be moved, but I feel like he probably just stays. My guess is that the Cavs probably just kind of approach it like maybe we do something small, but now that everybody's healthy, let's kind of see what we really have and then like see if we can maybe go further in the playoffs than we did last year. Now that they added a little bit more 3-point shooting, around those guys than they had last year.
Yeah, I think they're going to be relatively quiet. I have heard that Bogdan Bogdanovic and Sadiq Bey are linked to the Cavs, which is kind of interesting, but I don't know if they need to really necessarily take a swing on either of those guys because they are playing at such a stellar level. Like you were saying, they're sitting at third in the East, which is wild. I don't think a lot of people expected that, especially with how the season started for them. So I am intrigued what they do, but I think it'll probably be quiet.
Yeah. And then with the Bucks, I don't think there's really like the ability to pull off like a huge move anyways, because they already did that with Lillard. But obviously, right, like if they could make smaller moves around the margins, defense. Can you find a way to get a defensive wing? Can
Please.
you find a way to get a defensive guard? Because now that Doc is coaching the team, it seems like the young guys have kind of been excommunicated from the rotation, which is kind of what he does. So it's kind of now even more right. Of a like it now. There's a lot more pressure, I think, to acquire those type of guys. And those guys, I don't think we're going to play a whole lot in the playoffs, anyways. So I mean, again, if Caruso doesn't get moved, maybe you go for DeLon Wright, maybe. And kind of settle for something else, or maybe they get Dorian Finney-Smith. There's not a whole lot they can really move. I mean, but
Yeah.
it would probably have to be like what Pat Connaughton, or you sacrifice Bobby Portis, which I don't think they
No,
would
no,
do.
no. I
So
don't
it
think
feels
they
like
want to do that.
Connaughton probably. Um, but if they can get, either a guard or a wing, because you're not going to be able to do both. So I think you kind of have to pick which one you think is more pressing. So I would probably just gamble and say like go for the defensive guard, so that way you can close games with Lillard and another defensive guard. So that
Yeah.
way it doesn't have to be Malik Beasley. I would probably just gamble there and just kind of just be like, we'll just hopefully Giannis and Brook Lopez can hold it down. Maybe Jay Crowder's got something saved up in the playoffs. I don't know. So I feel like if you can only do one, try to get the guard. Unless you just believe like come playoff time, maybe Lillard will just be better defensively, like in terms of just more effort or whatever or focus. But I don't know.
Yeah,
That's what I think.
yeah, I'm thinking the same thing where it's like, they're not going to move any of the core guys like you're saying. I think Bobby Portis and Pat Connaughton are probably the only two on the block, and I wouldn't even really consider Bobby Portis on the block because I mean, I think he's very valuable to that team. So, and clearly their aspirations are a championship, so you don't want to shake things up too much. But it is kind of interesting. And a side note, it's kind of wild that Doc Rivers is going to be the
Yeah.
coach for the All-Star game, like you had
Right.
brought up a couple weeks ago. So, hey, it is what it is. But regardless, I think they'll probably be making a move where, like you said, you want a defensive-minded guard that can play alongside Lillard because they desperately need that. Because when you don't have like a ball, like a stopper at any point in the game, it kind of rears its ugly head late in games for sure.
Yeah. And then Celtics right there at the top of the East. So, again, probably another situation where like, can you get another, guard, wing, something like that?
Hmm.
Maybe another additional big. So that way you're not just relying on, Porzingis and Horford.
Yeah,
I know they've kind of, filled it in by playing some other guys like Keita
yeah,
and Luke Cornett. But I don't know. Like maybe you might want to get a little bit more of a reliable guy, or because again, I don't think that you can do both because they don't have they don't have a whole lot to be able to do.
right.
I know they have the trade exception. I don't know if they're going to be able to use it, but if you can only do one, I'd say probably get like the guard wing guy, that can play next to one of Tatum or Brown, so that way like you don't completely just fall apart when one of them's on the bench.
Yeah, agreed wholeheartedly. It would be intriguing to see, who that would be. Do you have any like thoughts on who that would be? Because that's the tough part. Like we really
Yeah,
don't
that's
know who's
right,
available at the moment right
right.
now. So I think that
Yeah,
might
that's
be
the.
more of a topic of conversation when it comes down to the actual day of the deadline. But do you have anybody off
Right.
the top of your head?
I mean, maybe you could maybe like a Dorian Finney-Smith if they can get him, or I think he makes too much, so it probably wouldn't be able to be him. But I don't know. I mean, like that's kind of the tough part. I mean, Jetty Osman or
Hey,
you know or somebody like that. I mean, like it's kind of tough because again, like their trade exception isn't that big, and most of their salaries are towards the guys that are playing a lot. So it's like it's not really a whole lot they can really do, in terms of picking up an impact guy. I know they've talked about, some Celtics fans have mentioned Isaiah Stewart, but I don't think that he fits into that exception. I'd have to go back and check.
yeah,
Um, but either way, something like that. And that, like you said, that's the tough part where it's like for some of these, you kind of would like to name specific names, but it's like, sometimes, like some of these are guys where it's like there's not a whole lot of rumors attached to them. So you kind of have to go outside the box, kind of like what you did last year where you mentioned D'Angelo Russell. I know he had been mentioned in rumors, but like, he had never been tied to LA. And
right.
then, you kind of were like, what if he went there? And then he ended up actually going there.
Yeah.
So
You just got to throw stuff out there. So I'm probably going to throw in Doug McDermott. I don't know.
yeah. Just like another forward and just see because
Yeah.
they like 3-point shooting anyways. That's like
Yeah. That's their bread and butter. They take like what,
yeah,
40
they take
plus?
the most. Yeah, they take the most in the NBA.
Yeah.
So now we're gonna move on to the West, right, and kind of work our way up, right? There's I guess fewer bad teams in the West than there are in the East.
Agreed.
But which is kind of interesting, right? Because you even if when you go all the way down to 12, right, that's a team that would be looking to improve. That's Golden State, right? Um, I don't know what they do honestly, right? Because a while ago you would have probably said something like move the young guys plus Chris Paul for something. But then you look at Jonathan Kuminga, and he's played very well, since he made his complaints, about Steve Kerr known to the public. So they may be in a thought process where they're not as inclined to deal him anymore, which I think makes sense because he's played pretty well. So you don't want to necessarily just give him up for a guy that can only help you right now. And it's tough for them too because they're in the second apron already. Well, I mean, they've been the most expensive roster for a while now, and so if you bring in long-term money, then that makes that makes each next year more punitive in terms of what you can do. So I honestly don't even know if they do a whole lot. Maybe they move Chris Paul, which I guess would be kind of a lot because of his contract. Um, but they need size. So could you maybe pick up, like you mentioned, a Kelly Olynyk, or maybe they get Capella or something like that. Could you get some other help, in terms of like maybe a more athletic guard or something like that. Yeah, maybe that's out there, but just so because with Gary Payton, he's been hurt so much this year. So how much? I mean, I'm assuming he'll be back at some point, but it's like, what's the likelihood that he gets hurt again? Because it's already happened twice with basically the same injury. So can you get a defensive guard in there? Right, that's what I'm thinking. Like outside of Payton, because he's been out so much. Right, like a Darrell Wright or not Delon Wright,
Delon.
excuse me.
Yeah,
Darrell Wright's the older.
holy
Yeah, that's a
moly.
throwback. Yeah, that's a throwback. Yeah, somebody like that. It's kind of the same names because those are the names we've heard. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, those are definitely the guys available. Shout out to Jonathan Kuminga, man. The pre and post haircut numbers have been wild. Like you were saying, Kuminga's been playing on another level. I don't think he's going to be available at the trade deadline. I'm thinking maybe more so we're looking at Andrew Wiggins and Chris Paul. I think we're probably looking at those two guys, which I think is fair, and I think that's the safer route to go. Because, I mean, at this point, yeah, I don't think you're going to be seeing too much more from Wiggins in terms of, increasing his level of play for the Warriors. So I think he's probably going to be gone. And then Chris Paul, the injury stuff, that doesn't help, but it's just a matter of that salary, man. It's $30 million. It's a lot of money. So somebody's going to have to do something about that. But I would definitely be looking at Chris Paul and Andrew Wiggins.
Yeah. Chris Paul, it's the value of next, I think in the offseason, it's basically an expiring contract.
Yeah.
Wiggins might be at a point where you may have to attach something to get off of it because he's just not been that great.
Yep.
He's had a couple of okay games as of late, but then he's also still had some stinkers. So it just feels like he's probably just not going to be what he was a couple of seasons ago, which is, which is weird. But, either way, you kind of just have to move on from it, I think. But again, I don't necessarily know what they end up doing because they're another team, unlike some of these other teams that has to factor in the financial stuff more so, right? Because most of the other teams in the second apron are much higher in the standings, but they're towards the bottom, right? So like a team like Denver is in the second apron, I think, but they're in the top spot of the East, right? Same with the Clippers, right? They're towards the top, so their approach is going to be a lot different. So they don't have as much that they have to do. And then moving on, the Rockets, right? They're 11th. We've heard stuff about the idea of maybe them chasing after a veteran or a star, right? Jalen Green, right? That could be a name to look at. Because he's, had a, I think, kind of disappointing season. He's had games where he's played well, but he's still had, but I think he's had more games where he's been, a little bit of a letdown. And I think that's where it probably makes sense. Can you get like a veteran guy that you can go to late in games and feel good about it? Because they don't really have that, right? Like, I guess, Şengün is their best player, but, it's a little bit different playing late in games through a center than it is through like a guard or a forward. So if you can get a guy on the perimeter that can do that, that's not Fred VanVleet, not that he's bad at all, but you'd like somebody that's a little bit better than that. But I guess maybe you don't have to move Green, but I feel like he'd probably be the most likely guy. And then you toss in like one of those other contracts that they have on there that's kind of just sitting around like Jock Landale. None of the other young guys you probably have to move, right? Especially because those guys have really stepped up as of late, right? Like Cam Whitmore. Who didn't really play at all during the early part of the season. He's played a lot more, and he's been very good, fantastic, right? Even Amin Thompson, right? He's also had games and stretches where he's played very well. So, I mean, again, like, I don't think they're looking to be a quote-unquote contender this year, but it sounds like Udoka is kind of pushing for them to, make, more of a, go all in move to acquire some more veteran talent to kind of make a push for the playoffs. Because again, he was coaching Boston last year, so he probably would prefer to coach a more competitive roster. And it sounds like he's had, a lot of influence on the shape of the roster because apparently he wanted them to get Dylan Brooks and Fred VanVleet over James Harden. So, they're in a spot where, like, again, record wise, it may not look great, but if you look at what they've done last year, right, they've already won more games than they did last year, and they're barely more than halfway through the season. So
Yeah, the Rockets, I think they have one of the more intriguing deadline kind of I guess itineraries. That's the best way that I could describe it, because we've been hearing some very weird stuff like Jalen Green is potentially going to be available, and it's not the first time that teams have given up on younger players. I guess we could like throw it back to Rasheed Wallace for the Wizards, or like maybe even Shea SGA. How about Shea? Like we've seen
right.
teams give up on younger players very early on, but it all depends on the deal, obviously. But they have a lot of young players with, I think, varying levels of star potential for sure, and I think it could be interesting to see what they do. But I think I guess having Jalen Green available is intriguing. And then also, I guess, looking around Jayshawn Tate, I think that's also intriguing as well.
Right.
But they do need to do something, because if since you don't have your draft picks, you need to be making moves. Because you're not in the best situation standings wise, which is okay. You do have future. You do have your future, and you do have development to look forward to, especially with a brand new head coach. And they did make the Steven Adams move, which was great, I think. But regardless, you do need to make another splash, and I am expecting some noise from them.
Yeah. And then moving on, the Jazz, right? So they're a team that has, a decent number of guys, that could either stay or could be on the move, right? Because we've heard almost like every guy on this roster at different points involved in some type of rumor, from Lauri Markkanen all the way down to, other guys. So, I mean, I've guessed, like, in terms of most likely guys, probably Kelly Olynyk, and then maybe Clarkson. And then after that, I mean, I don't think Markkanen gets moved. I know there was, a lot of people have been talking about it earlier in the year, but I just don't see it, unless there's like some crazy Godfather offer that some team puts out there. And then after that, Sexton, I don't know, because I know he's been in rumors and whatnot, but he's played pretty well, and he's been, like a decent part of why they've been good as of late, right? Like they've started, a interesting backcourt of Chris Dunn and Sexton, but it's worked and it's been pretty good. They've, gone on more of a losing streak as of late, so maybe they've come back down to earth a little bit after that crazy hot stretch they had. But yeah, I would say Kelly Olynyk, any team that needs like a veteran big that's like a stretch five guy that's been in some playoff games. And then Jordan Clarkson is like a scorer. I know he's been, rumored as like a potential Nick target, right? Like if you don't get Bruce Brown, but you get like, Clarkson and Olynyk, that's pretty solid because you get another big in case Robinson's completely done. And then you get a scorer in Clarkson. So, I mean, something like that. But I don't expect, like I said, I don't expect Markkanen to be moved. Collins, I don't think will be moved at this point because he's played well enough that I think he's probably going to be fine. So that's what I would probably say. I mean, maybe Sexton, but I think most likely Olynyk and Clarkson.
Yeah.
Olynyk, then Clarkson.
Yeah, in terms of ordering, I would definitely say the same. I would definitely start with Olynyk. I think he's drawn a lot of interest from a lot of teams that do need some size and some playmaking at that big man spot. And then obviously Jordan Clarkson could easily be a backup point guard or even a starting point guard on some teams. I would prefer him to be a backup. And then obviously Colin Sexton, I think he's played pretty good for the Utah Jazz this season. So I think he has some value, but it's just a matter of, do you really want to let him go? And Clarkson as well, because it all depends like how many moves are they going to make? Because I think it's probably you got to get rid of one or the other, that kind of deal. Right. So that's what I'd be looking at for them. But I think they will be making a lot of moves.
Next up is the Lakers. They're 26 and 25. They just won their last couple of games. They got hit with, some bad news, right, in regards to Jared Vanderbilt, right? He played well, started in the Celtics game, got hurt at the end of the first half. Sounds like it's a pretty bad foot injury that at best is going to keep him out for several weeks, but at worst, and it sounds like more than likely, his season is probably done, which is unfortunate because he missed the first 20 games. When he first came back, didn't really look like himself, especially on the offensive end. Didn't really do anything on offense. And then the last, 5 or so games, he's been in double figures, like basically almost every game, aside from, I think, one game where he got tossed. So that's probably changed their it may have changed their trade outlook a little bit. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, we already knew that they were probably looking at, moving D'Angelo Russell, not because they hate him or anything like that, but because that's one of the only guys that, other than LeBron and AD, you can move and actually get something relatively substantial back, right? We've obviously talked about DeJounte Murray. And then after that, right, then the other ones are Rui Hachimura, who makes, I think, 15, 16-ish million. Now he's starting in place of Vanderbilt. My guess is that if Vanderbilt hadn't have gotten hurt, he probably would have gone back to starting. I don't know why we had to wait 50 games in to do that, but
Yeah.
regardless, um, either way,
W coach, man.
yeah, either way, like after that, the other guys, if they get moved, probably like, to fill in salary, right? Like say maybe they move like JHS, Jalen Hood Scafino, or Max Christie, maybe, not that you have to move them, but, again, if you're, trying to add in like, because they only have the one pick they can trade anyways. So, in absence of a second or third pick, you may have to give up one of those younger guys. So that's what I'm guessing is probably D'Angelo Russell's probably the most likely, especially if it's DeJounte Murray. And then after that, if it's not Rui or Austin Reeves, then it would probably have to be one of the other smaller contracts because I could also see them doing one of those trades where they like just throw a guy in there because I think they're pretty close to the hard cap, or whatever that next tier is for the tax. So they're probably going to do that to move a little under there so that way they have a little bit more flexibility, I think, for the buyout market as well. So, because again, we've talked about them with DeJounte Murray. And then after that, I think, people have also mentioned Dorian Finney-Smith. But if you get Dorian Finney-Smith, then that probably means you'd also have to move Rui, right? So, because I think he's the other one where the salary matches up. But yeah, like I said, probably more athleticism in the backcourt, and you're probably going to have to target a wing. And then if you can get a cheap backup center, that's not Jackson Hayes or Christian Wood, even though Hayes has played better as of late, but maybe you want to get like more of a veteran guy that's a little bit more,
Established.
reliable or experienced, right? Like a Drummond, or maybe you sign one that's sitting in free agency, even though I don't think there's that many sitting there. So something like that. But we've already talked about it at different points, right? We said they need more two-way guys. So, stuff like that. We've already talked about it.
Yeah. What would you think of maybe like Gafford going to the Lakers or something like that?
So his salary, what is it?
It's like 12. It's 12.
It's 12. So that would have to be either Reeves, Rui, or D'Lo. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, I don't necessarily know because I don't think they're going to trade Austin Reeves, right? Because I mean,
No.
they've already said they're not going to trade him unless it's like for some crazy all-star guy, which I don't think is going to be available. I don't think they would trade Rui for Daniel Gafford because I just don't think that makes a whole lot of sense.
Agreed.
So I think they probably will just
They'll go on the
keep
cheaper
forgetting.
end of things.
I forgot Gabe Vincent. That's the other guy because he hasn't played. So
Yeah,
it's
he's been
like you
hurt.
almost so you almost forget that he's there. That's the other salary that you could move. If he's potentially not coming back. So that's the other guy. I think he makes like 10-ish million. So I don't know if 10 and 12, in the trade machine add up. But if you did that, maybe. But I don't think they're going to probably spend a lot of capital on acquiring a backup center. I think they would go cheaper
So you think they'll
and
cheap
then
out?
use
Okay.
more of that capital to acquire either a guard or a wing. That's what I'm thinking because
Yeah.
you got to get somebody that can help. You're not going to replace Vanderbilt completely, but you got to have somebody at that position. And then, obviously, if you're trying to get an upgrade at guard, then that's where D'Angelo Russell comes in.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that their emphasis is really placed on finding that defensive wing, which I think they really do need, especially with LeBron getting up there in age. And then isn't it kind of like really weird that, Clutch Sports had to come out and say, no, LeBron is not, being traded. He's not going to ask for a trade. It's kind of wild,
Right.
but, you do have to understand that the frustrations were kind of over the boiling point.
But I think that there was like somebody on Twitter or X or whatever that I think had just kind of, I don't know who they are, but I think they had put out something like, yeah, LeBron, the Lakers are fielding trade offers for LeBron or something. And I don't even know who this guy is. I know like people had screenshotted stuff that he had said in the past.
Yeah,
like
it was
he
about
had
the
said that,
Kawhi
like,
thing, right?
yeah, and I think also LeBron leaving Miami to go to Cleveland or
Right.
something like that. But again, I don't know who this guy is. So it's
Right.
like, it could just be kind of lucky stuff.
It's
You know
just
what
funny
I mean? 'Cause
how
like
they
that-
had to debunk it, though. That's just,
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
wild.
Exactly. And I think also there was the thing about Rich Paul having to like also kind of like, and New York having to mend fences because they've had some issues in terms of I think, a lot of the New York guys are rep by a different agency. So
Yeah.
And then moving on, the Dallas Mavericks. They are 26-23, right? They played pretty well to start off the season. They've not been as great as of late. They had a pretty rough loss to Milwaukee where they were up like 20 early in the first half and then blew it all at halftime and then ended up getting blown out in the second half. We know what they need, obviously. The offense, has slipped as of late. I think that's because Kyrie's been out. He just hasn't been healthy, unfortunately, for a good chunk of this season. But even when they've played together, I don't think the record's been that crazy, but that's also because the defense is not great. So we already talked about earlier, right? The stuff they're looking for, probably some type of help in the front court. We thought maybe wing, but they may just eschew that in favor of going for, more like fours. So we've already talked about it. PJ Washington, Kyle Kuzma, right? Maybe Jeremy Grant as like a plan C or D or something. Maybe they say let's get Dorian Finney-Smith back. I'm not saying they will, but guys like that. Because you need more defense, you need more rebounding, you need a little bit more size. That would also suggest to me, if they are looking for fours, that would suggest that Grant Williams, they're maybe not all that thrilled with now. Even though he played pretty well to start off the season because he was shooting really well, that shooting has tailed off. So now I think some of the more problematic issues, when the shot's not falling, have come up. So maybe they still keep him, and he's just a backup. But either way, that kind of lets you know they already know, yeah, we need more front court help, right? Maxi Kleber hasn't played a whole lot this year because I think he's been hurt, and I think he's regressed a little bit anyway. So that's what I would think.
Yeah, this is an interesting team because I think I put a lot of thought into this. I even came up with a hypothetical trade. Obviously, it's highly in favor of the Mavericks because that's who we're talking about. But it's a 3-team trade. Let me know what you think of this. So Kyle Kuzma, PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, all to the Mavericks. Wizards get Hardaway, Rashawn Holmes, Miles Bridges, and a first-round pick. Hornets, they get Grant Williams, Josh Green. Basically fleece the Hornets, but regardless, regardless, what do you think of that? Do you think that could work? Because I think that's realistic, but highly in favor of the Mavericks.
Yeah. I think the issue is that's a lot of guys, that are going to Dallas in one swoop.
Yeah.
So I feel like maybe one, and I don't, and they all play the same position. So I feel, they're all basically fours.
Yeah.
So, maybe you could consider Washington like a small ball 5, at 6'7" or whatever. But that's probably the main issue with it. Because I feel like they're probably just going to get one of those guys. I don't think they get 2 or 3.
Oh, you don't think
they're
going to get 2?
Nah, I just don't really see it because once you start talking about 2 guys, then you're gonna have to start moving multiple rotational pieces, and some of those guys you're okay with moving on from, but I don't know if they're ready to move on from some other ones. So we'll see.
I think they're ready to move on from Grant Williams and Josh Green, honestly. But hey, I could be completely wrong.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I think they just extended Josh Green, so that would be kind of interesting if they ended up extending him just to trade him. Can they even do that at this point?
Yeah, they can.
Okay, so yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, either way, Dallas needs to find again more 2-way guys. Especially in the front court, because again, it's kind of hard to do that with the guards because Luka and Kyrie are gonna play so much. I mean, it's kind of hard to get a guy that's gonna play 30 minutes alongside those 2 guys because they're both guards.
Yeah,
so I mean, I guess
you
could
say
Luka
Kuzma's gonna go to the Mavs. That's what I'm feeling.
Yeah. So next up, Phoenix, right? 28-21. They've been playing better as of late. Obviously, we've talked at different points what they need. The defense has been better. Beal's been back. Beal's back, and since he's come back, right, they've looked a lot better which makes sense, right? Because obviously they, put a lot of stock into him. And when he plays well, that makes them a lot better just because of what he can do. As an offensive guy, because I think he's probably the best attacker of the 3, right, in terms of being able to drive, and finish around the basket. Because I think Booker and Durant are a little more comfortable shooting pull-up shots.
Yeah.
And then Nurkic, right, he's played well, right? Give him credit. He's been able to stay healthy. So that's obviously been huge for them as well, right? Because when he plays, he helps give them more size and playmaking and passing. It's just, again, can you trust him in terms of his health? But the role guys have kind of just been up and down. Some guys have been okay for stretches. Other guys, not so much. So, I mean, you don't really have much in terms of guys that you can realistically move, right? It's basically Nasir Little, Grayson Allen, or Yusuf Nurkic. And I don't think they move Nurkic. And I don't really think they're going to move Grayson Allen because he's, slid into that starting spot, this season for the most part. So, I mean, it's probably going to have to be Nasir Little and one of those other guys. And again, is it Bridges? Is it something like that. Either so you can't, because you're not going to be able to get multiple things. You're going to probably have to settle for one. So either a backup point guard or an athletic, wing, right? So you're
Yeah.
going to have to settle for which one. So if you get the wing, then you're basically saying we're just going to trust that those three guys can kind of figure out how to handle the playmaking in the playoffs. If you get the backup point guard, you're saying we don't trust those guys to be able to do all the playmaking in the playoffs. So I don't know which one they end up choosing, but given the fact that we've heard more about a guy like a Bridges than a guy like a Tyus Jones, my guess is they're probably leaning towards trying to pick up one of those wings. So I think that's what they're probably going to go after.
Yeah, I'd be intrigued. I think they could potentially also go for a guy like Chris Dunn. Maybe that's somebody we didn't even mention for Utah, oddly enough.
Right.
But I think Chris Dunn would be a likable candidate for them, and then also Andre Drummond. I think that would also be a guy that could potentially help them out, and then Bridges
Right.
for sure. So those are kind of like my
Yeah.
top three candidates because I just don't really know who they're going to be
Yeah.
moving. I think they should be looking to acquire and just give out whoever they want. So
Right.
that's how I
Yeah,
feel.
because some of those guys, if they move them, you're just swapping minimum contracts. And then like, for some of those guys, that will probably work.
Yeah,
Like a team may not be like, oh, we're not going to take this minimum contract guy,
you're
for
right.
this minimum contract guy. Like that's just, unless it's like a team that signed a minimum contract guy on a bargain and they're playing great, right? That's a little bit different than kind of just swapping minimum contract role players.
Yes, sir.
Then moving on, New Orleans, 28 and 21. I don't know what they do. I mean,
Yeah.
Valanciunas, they may, I think he's in the last year of his deal, so we'll see what they do with him, right? Obviously, they did the Kyra Lewis thing to avoid the luxury tax. I mean, if they can, I mean, they have McCollum as the point guard and then Alvarado as the backup point guard. I mean, I think it would be nice if you could have like maybe another traditional type point guard, maybe in certain lineups, just so that way you can have a guy that can help, set up Zion in the pick and roll or something like that, or maybe play off of Ingram or something like that. But I don't really know if they're gonna really do a whole lot because they have like a decent number of guys on the roster that are good. So like, I don't think that there's really like a whole lot of room for them to make some other significant move. So if they do anything, it's probably small and it's probably something like that, unless like they know like, oh, Jonas Valanciunas is not coming back, like in terms of re-signing or something like that. But I feel like it's probably just more likely they do something.
Yeah, and it's like, we kind of heard that they did take a swing at Bridges, so they did make their swing and made a
Yeah,
serious
McAllister.
offer. Yeah, McCall Bridges, excuse me. So they did make a serious offer on him, and that didn't really work out, obviously. So, I'd probably be looking at them to potentially move Valanciunas. I know a lot of people had earlier in the year Jared Allen tied to the Pelicans. I'm not sure
Yeah,
if that's really going to work out. I feel like that's more of a dream scenario for the Pelicans, but regardless, I think they're in a good spot. So if they don't do anything, I think you feel okay with it. And if they do something, I think it'll be a move that'll potentially help them down the line.
yeah, do. So moving on, Sacramento Kings, um, 29 and 19, fifth in the NBA Western Conference. So we've talked
Joy.
about them. Yeah, so we've talked about them before at different points, right? Where again, like, offensively, they've actually slipped this year. They've been 14th. And then defensively they're better, right? They're 17th. They're not like bottom 10 defensively, but the offense has taken a step back, which is interesting because the record is still pretty good. I mean, obviously, part of the interesting thing offensively is that, De'Aaron Fox is having a great season. I think he's cooled off a little bit since the earlier part, but he's still averaging 27 and a half, 4 rebounds, 5 assists, and then 38 from three, which is cool. That's through 42 games. So that's a pretty big sample size to kind of suggest, yeah, he's improved as a 3-point shooter, which is great because that obviously is going to help him offensively, in a playoff series. Because, when in the past teams may back off of him and dare him to shoot, but you can't really do that too much anymore. Um, I don't know. There's a decent number of ways this could go. I don't think they would do anything major unless it's like you said, a Kyle Kuzma, or somebody like that. But we just haven't heard anything about the Kings as of late. And they may just not do anything. They may just feel like, you know what? Let's not do anything crazy. Let's not make a panic move. Let's just kind of just be okay with where we're at and just kind of, just see what happens and then, do something in the offseason. I feel like they may end up doing that just because, there is a danger in like doing something, you know, like going too much or too far in too early, and then you kind of screw up, right? Like if you move Keegan Murray for somebody and then it doesn't work out, then congratulations, you kind of just played yourself there. So I mean, my guess is that they probably do something a little more minor. I mean, again, we know they need probably a little bit more at this point. You could argue just two-way guys because again, the offense is kind of split despite their two guys playing pretty well and having basically career years. Fox particularly. So after that, again, part of it's like, well, how many of these guys can you rely on consistently, right? Like Kevin Herter, you know, guys off the bench. It's not great. So maybe a little bit more depth. Is Davion Mitchell a guy that they maybe finally decide to move because it doesn't feel like his role on the team, at this point makes a whole lot of sense. He's not really giving them anything on offense and doesn't really play a whole lot. So, I mean, that's probably the main guy that I could see them maybe move. But outside of that, I don't really know what else they do unless they end up, kind of surprising us and going for, a more expensive forward spot. Because I think that would be the more surprising move at this point.
Yeah, and the Kings are an intriguing spot because I feel like early on in the season we would have been talking about them a little bit differently in terms of what they needed to do. Because I think there was a time when I think we both felt that the Kings might have needed to upgrade over Harrison Barnes and Kevin Herter, or but that is. So, but
I'm
I
not
think
saying they shouldn't. I
right.
just don't know if they will.
Right,
Yeah.
because I think they have played better as of late, and showed us, why they were pretty good last year. But regardless, I think they're probably going to be linked. Yeah, I don't trust it either. So that's why I'm thinking they need to make a big swing and definitely take a swing at Kyle Kuzma. I think it shouldn't hurt and it won't hurt to do that. But yeah, because I think they missed out on a couple of guys like maybe OG Anunoby, Siakam, and now Caruso is apparently not really on the trading block, and then Levine is out as well. So I think they do need to make a move, or else this is going to be really bad for them come playoff time. Just saying, it's going to be another flame out.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know if they're going to end up doing anything. Like, you know what I mean? Like, not that
100%.
they shouldn't do anything. I just don't know if they actually will.
Right, because what can they really do? They missed out on a lot of guys.
Yeah. Now moving on. Now we're in the top four, in the Western Conference, right? The Nuggets, the Clippers, the Timberwolves, and the Thunder. Nuggets, I don't think there's really a whole lot they're going to do. We already know they're really good. Again, I think it's kind of like this championship hangover where it's like, they're not going all in every game, but when they need to, and just to kind of show off, they'll show what they can do because they've already beaten, the two top teams in the East, and we've seen them compete against the other teams as well. So I think probably just get some more bench help because I don't know necessarily if you really trust, the depth coming off the bench. I mean, they did. It's not like their bench was crazy last year because it wasn't. It was like 8 guys and sometimes 6 or 7 in the playoffs. So if you can get like maybe one other veteran to help you out, that would probably be nice, right? Either, some type of forward, probably, just so that way, like if Michael Porter Jr. doesn't play that great in some playoff games, you have like somebody else to turn to. That might just be like more of a 3-and-D guy because I think that's what they're trying to do with Peyton Watson, but we'll see if he can actually do it, come playoff time.
Yeah, I'm looking at them for front court depth for sure because I think relying on DeAndre Jordan at times for some backup center minutes is kind of risky for sure because I'm not gonna like hate on him, but he's pretty much a dinosaur at this point. But I just don't really think that they're gonna make a ton of moves. You know what I mean? Because I feel like they're solid as they are, but like you said, the bench is definitely downgraded. I think it's safe to say significantly from last year for sure. So it's all about monitoring the trade market, and that's what I think they're going to do. They're probably going to be one of the last teams to make a move for sure if they do. But I think it's going to be overall very quiet for them. But I think they definitely need some help off the bench.
Yeah, and then moving on, the Clippers, obviously, they've been great as of late, 32-15, third in the West. Obviously, their guys have been playing really well together, since, that weird stretch early on when they were losing a lot.
Yeah.
Now Zubac is back, so you got him as the starting big, who's played well with Harden, right? You got Plumlee coming off the bench. So my guess is like maybe they look to see, can we get that spot that PJ Tucker and Bones Highland are occupying where they're not really playing, but they're taking up salary on the roster. Can we actually move that to maybe get, another forward probably, right? So that way you have a guy next to Kawhi Leonard that's like a 4 or next to Paul George that's like a 3-4, or maybe a 4-5 type guy. Can they get somebody like that, to kind of, like basically like what they were maybe hoping to get out of PJ Tucker, but probably better. And then combine that with Bones Highland, who's not really playing. And you don't really need that as much since you have Westbrook coming off the bench as opposed to being a starter. So, and Harden will probably play more come playoff time anyway. So that's what I'm thinking, right? And you got Norman Powell as a backup scoring guard. So my guess is probably like, can you acquire some type of forward, with PJ Tucker and Bones Highland? And that's probably it. Because again, you're pretty much set at most of the other spots.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to gauge what the Clippers are going to do, but I guess like their three goals should be maybe a replacement for Bones Highland. I don't know because Bones has kind of been meh against some
He hadn't really
competition.
played.
Yeah,
He's been out of
exactly.
he's been out of the
Yeah.
rotation.
Yeah, and he's only been averaging 6 points, I think, to his like 10 career. So, he's kind of on the decline. But maybe find a better guard in that sense, and then maybe a better replacement for, Zubac if he goes down again. Hopefully he doesn't. But, I mean, sometimes you look at Daniel Tice and Mason Plumlee and you're like, okay, they're kind of just mediocre mid at best. So maybe finding some backup big man depth, that could potentially be a goal as well. And then maybe also another depth piece at like the forward position, because I think, it is interesting. Kawhi and Paul George have played a lot, and they've been very healthy and they've been playing at a great level as well. But sometimes you just feel like, hey, something might happen and you might really need to get that backup
Right.
wing.
Next up, Minnesota Timberwolves, 34-15. Second in the Western Conference. I think now are they first? I don't. I think they are first now because Chris Finch was named, the head coach, for the All-Star game. So
On ESPN, it has OKC and Minnesota tied at 35 and 15. They're both 35 and 15 apiece. So,
but I guess since Finch is the coach, they got the
yeah,
tiebreaker. So, obviously they've played very well this year. They've been a little bit more spotty as of late, although the last couple of games they've been better. Obviously, when you look at the roster, right, the Towns Gobert fit has been better this year. Gobert has been great. Towns has been great. He was named an All-Star. Edwards, been a little bit more quiet as of late, but he still has his really good games, and I think he's been great this year, anyways. Really, it's mainly just been Mike Conley has played well, but you'd like to maybe get a little bit more of an insurance, for him. Again, we already talked about it. That's why maybe you can get a guy like a Tyus Jones, just somebody who can slide into that other point guard spot, so that way if he either isn't playing well or is just out because he's had an injury history at different points, your offense doesn't completely turn into a disorganized mess like it seems to whenever he's not out there. Um, Maybe use Kyle Anderson as the piece, because I don't think he's been quite as impactful this year. Not that he's bad, but just again, they don't have a lot of guys where I'm looking at it like we must move these guys. So that's probably the piece that you'd have to sacrifice, to bring in like a Tyus Jones or somebody like that. But outside of that, I mean, again, Naz Reid is your backup big. Maybe you might be okay with getting a backup forward. I mean, because again, outside of McDaniels, at the three, it's like Troy Brown Jr. Who's okay, but maybe you're looking at upgrade there. But again, it's another team where you have so much salary between certain guys that you're probably only going to be able to do one thing. And I think probably the more pressing need is the guard thing, the backup point guard.
for
So
sure.
that's what I would say. Like, get Tyus Jones if you can.
Yeah, I have a couple of candidates for them. I would say Monte Morris is definitely one of them.
Okay. Yeah, that's
I
the other one. If
yeah.
the team can't get Tyus Jones, get Monte Morris.
Yeah, get Monte Morris, Tyus Jones, or the anti Tyus Jones and Jordan Clarkson, where it's like pretty much scores, potentially some turnovers here and there, but hey, because Tyus Jones, we all know he takes care of the ball, but Jordan Clarkson is a little bit more reckless, but he does add a little bit of scoring potential as well. So I think those should be their top targets. It's got to be a guard, backup,
right. And then Oklahoma City 35-15, right there with Minnesota at the top of the West. Obviously, we've talked about them multiple times. They need more size, right? They need some other big guys next to Chet. Whether or not it's next to him or, off the bench as a second unit guy. We've already talked about it, right? A guy like, Isaiah Stewart, Clint Capella. Maybe you go cheap and get Andre Drummond, or somebody like that, because it doesn't have to be an expensive backup big man. It's kind of, the antithesis of the guys that they like, because it seems like they prefer more skilled guys that can do stuff with the ball, and that's not really what any of those guys do. But sometimes you just need to put a big guy out there just so that way you're prepared to face, some of these teams with a little bit more size, out in the West, right? Like say, if you're Oklahoma City and your first round matchup is like, LA, right? And you got to play LeBron and AD in the first round. They don't really have like a lot of big personnel to match up with those guys. Or, let's say you don't face LA in the first round, but maybe in the second round or the conference finals, you play Denver, or somebody like that, right?
Yeah.
Like they have a lot of size, that might kind of bother them. So, That's probably their main need, I would say, because I mean you're pretty much set at most of the other spots. And I don't think any of their core guys are going anywhere. So my guess is like if they get one of those bigs, it's probably for like Davis Bertans or one of those guys that's just not playing at all, and then maybe they throw in a pick or something since they have like 40 million picks.
Yeah, I'm looking at Finney Smith for the OKC Thunder. I think that would be really, really valuable for them. And I don't know. It's tough because I feel like, they also can be looking to sell a little bit. I think maybe Josh Giddey could potentially be a realistic guy that they could potentially sell on. But yeah, they definitely need some size. But at the forward position, I'm looking at, Finney Smith and like you were saying earlier, maybe Drummond or somebody like that. You just need some more size, rebounding, or another wing. That's what I would go with for them.
Right. Yeah. And if the forward that you pick up can rebound, that can help too.
Exactly.
And that's where you could play a guy as like a small ball four, and then he can grab boards and box out. Because again, they're one of the worst rebounding teams in the league, so they need help there.
For sure.
Yeah. So that's pretty much, all of the teams, that we've covered, right? We covered all 30 in terms of like, what they got, what they're looking for, what they might be selling. Because again, the trade deadline is, fastly approaching. I mean, it's on February 8th, right? When this episode comes out, it'll be the 5th. So basically, a few days after that, right, will be the trade deadline. It's possible there may be trades, before Thursday. But, obviously we've already talked about it. We're going to do a live stream, from noon to like 3:30-ish, maybe later, depending on if more comes out. Because again, we don't know what the trade deadline may hold. It could be quiet. It could be very active. And we could have stuff that literally comes down to the last minute, right? Because I remember we were kind of sweating bullets last year, kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And then some guys just ended up not getting moved at the last second. So, but either way, I guess, kind of final thoughts, like, are there any names that like you're thinking of that like nobody's talked about where you're like, this guy could actually be moved, to another team, like maybe a surprise one that you've been thinking of, or, or are you more so kind of just like tied to the guys that everybody's been talking about?
As of right now, I've been really tied to all the guys that everybody's been talking about. Maybe, I don't know. It's so hard to gauge. I might just throw
Josh Giddey. You mentioned Josh Giddey, like you're thinking like that could be like a
I'll do that.
guy.
I'm gonna work some magic. Hopefully we can get some remnants of the D'Lo magical trade that happened last year. I'm gonna throw it out there. Josh Giddey goes somewhere. I don't know where exactly, but I think he's gonna be on the move.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely possible. That something like that could happen. I mean, because I'm not saying it will. And to be honest, I don't think Oklahoma City is gonna move any of their top young guys, but again, you just never know because there's always one trade every deadline, that just kind of comes out of nowhere. And again, who knows? Maybe Zach LaVine ends up actually still getting moved despite the fact that he's injured because Steven Adams got moved. So you never know. A team may just be like, you know what? Let's just get him right now, and then we'll just have him for next season. I'm
also throwing Robert Williams in there as well.
Yeah. So honestly, I think I'm gonna just throw that out there. Not saying that it's going to happen, but I'm going to do that as like my shocker one, like a Zach LaVine.
Watch all three of these things come true, and then we get to bask in all the glory.
Yeah, but so pretty much, news, rumors. We don't really need to do that, right? Because we basically talked about, all the stuff, that's been going on, as of late. Obviously, I guess, Steph scored 60, Marc Gasol retired, but so shout out to those two.
Yeah.
But outside of that, pretty much not anything else that we need to discuss. So because again, this is the last episode before the trade deadline stream. So everybody come on and join in, and hang out with us, from noon onwards. And again, don't forget to like, comment. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you comment, we'll read it at the beginning, of the video. Hopefully, if you're in the live stream, you comment in there and kind of talk about what's going on. So
yes, sir.
We appreciate it, and we'll see you guys, either in the live stream on Thursday or we'll see you for the next episode on Friday.